Hello, welcome to Mind Chat. I'm Philip Goff.
Hello, I'm a simulation of Keith Frankish. Keith couldn't be here today, but we have a backup simulation of him who's talking to you now. It's only a partial simulation, not as good as the real thing, but it will do for the time being, hopefully. Well,
it's got to be an improvement anyway. On what went before.
Well, like the real Keith, I'm very patient with this kind of thing. So, how are you
doing?
How am I doing? I'm cold, actually. It's quite cold here this week.
It's snowing, isn't it?
Snowing in Greece. It's
wow.
It's been very strange, but otherwise I'm okay. Trying to write, trying to entertain people on Twitter as usual. How about you?
I'm good. I'm living the dream. I'm on research leave,
so you've got a new book.
Just lying in bed. Yeah, I follow in the great tradition of John Maynard Keynes, René Descartes, and who was that guy who won the war? Winston Churchill, of working in bed. So I do work hard, but horizontally. So yeah, it's brilliant.
You're starting a new book. You're working on a new book, I believe.
Yes. Another trade book, The Purpose of Existence.
You're tackling the big issues, Philip.
Well, yeah, get this one out the way, and then
get The Purpose of Existence sorted.
Purpose of Existence out the way. Then
get that out the way, and then you can get on something really interesting. Yeah.
Or retire, maybe.
Become a gardener. Exactly. Once you've done that, it's gardening.
Yeah.
Get it all wrapped up.
Go into gardening. So just before we bring in our esteemed guest, we have just run through the lineup. We've got coming next week David Papineau, who is we're going to be talking about his book on perception, and he's a materialist, and we should have some good fights there. I think me and David Papineau have had a lot of fights in the past. In March, Helen Stewart on free will. And Sophie Barrich in April on smellosophy, the philosophy and neuroscience of smell.
Yes.
Angela Mendelevici in May. Actually, I've just realized I've double booked May. We've also got Sean Carroll and Barry Lower. So people know we had this 3-hour debate on whether the physical world is causally closed with Sean Carroll, and we can't stop it. We can't stop the debate. It just keeps going on. So we decided to get some adjudication from the philosopher of physics, Barry Lower. So we're going to have the two of them on, and I will thereby be proved right. So we're going to do that as well in May, as well as talking to Angela Mendelevici about thought and consciousness. So it's a great lineup.
Absolutely.
No, we're not charging for this, but do, if you can, subscribe to the podcast and the channel, write us a review so we can get these out to a broader audience. Should we bring in our guest?
Yes, let's bring in our guest.
We're very pleased to welcome David Chalmers. Welcome to Mind Chat.
Welcome, Dave.
You're muted. The techno-philosopher is muted himself.
All right. Great pleasure to be jacking into your simulation. All right. With the distinguished Sim Keith, Sim Philip. Wow, this simulation is totally indistinguishable from physical reality. I'm impressed.
We've been working hard on it. It's normally a few glitches, but
maybe a few recycled jokes here and there.
It's not too hard to simulate us, actually, to be honest. I mean, you can probably do it on the game of life. Really? Well, you certainly could.
Yeah. So, David,
I'm thinking a quantum computer at least.
A few old beer cans, I think. Beer cans and string. Dave, it's lovely to have you here. Thank you for coming. I've been tweeting this week about your book, which I've been reading, and I know Philip has too. And well, I think it's wonderful.
Oh, it's great to be on Mind Chat, such a famous venue for web philosophy. And yeah, I mean, we all go way back, hanging out on boats off the coast of Greenland, gosh, 7 or 8 years ago now, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Such a pleasure to be here with you in this virtual space.
When did we first meet, Dave? I was trying to think. Was it at one of the big Tucson conferences? Have you any idea? I'm trying to think.
I was thinking an AAP in Sydney, this Australasian Association of Philosophy in Sydney, around maybe 2006 or so.
Wow.
At a pub called The Rose. And this young British philosopher came up to me and said, "Chalmers, you're wrong. You may be right about a couple of things, but mostly you're wrong. And here's why." It was great. Never look back.
I like people I disagree with. Actually, we agree on practically everything, about a lot of things, don't we? But
he said, "I agree with your conclusions, but I think your arguments are bad." That's the worst. When they agree with your conclusions and they still think your arguments are bad.
Yeah. Oh, happy days. The innocence of youth. But yeah, Dave is my unpaid mentor every time I need advice on some philosophical or academic matter. I'm like, "Dave, what can I do? What do I do about this?" And so, yeah.
Well, Dave has given me a lot. I should say Dave has given me a lot of excellent advice too. That's one thing I think Dave is an exemplary philosopher in that he gives constructive advice to anyone who's working seriously on in this area. Whether he agrees with them or not, he will give helpful, constructive feedback. I think it's a model.
Oh, thanks. I think we actually first met. Didn't we first meet over over audio or something?
I interviewed you for the Open University about nearly 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. I think I'm in Arizona. In the studio in Arizona, not unlike this, although these days you can do it from home.
That's right. I was quite nervous. It was the first time I'd done anything like this. And I was scheduled to talk to you and to Daniel down at different weeks. And I thought, well, I think Dave will be quite nice. But at that time, I didn't know Dan. And I thought Dan might be quite severe. And so I was more relaxed with you, I think, actually. And I really enjoyed the recording.
Yeah.
And actually, both of them came out well. But we set you up, you and Dan, as the two what's the name? The two big antagonists behind the course we were creating.
Oh, someone's going to dig that up. Is that something you can find out there on the web?
I think I have a copy somewhere. I'll link to it. It's the course or the audio. I have the audio, I'm sure.
Yeah, that would be great. We could put it out on Mind Chat. We could. Yeah. So in case people don't know, David Chalmers is University Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience. Has that changed? Was it always neuroscience?
It's true. I'm a member of the Center for Neuroscience, which gives me which makes me a neuroscientist, at least in my title.
Right.
I complain.
At New York University and director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness, and hugely influential figure in the philosophy of consciousness and cognitive science. And his book, The Conscious Mind, from the 1990s, really shook things up and reinvigorated the debate in many ways. And around this time, Dave coined the phrase, the hard problem of consciousness, that really, I guess, for many people, homed in on the philosophical core of the problem of consciousness. So, and he's just come out with this book, Reality Plus, which I think is incredible, actually, because Dave's had such an influence outside of academic philosophy with scientists and the public, but has never actually written a book aimed at a general audience. So, I mean, your book, The Conscious Mind, which has had, such an impact, it's actually quite difficult. I mean, I guess it's quite accessible for an academic book, but it's, it's not an easy read, is it? Whereas
it was actually my PhD thesis, so it was just a slightly revised version of my PhD thesis. And I hoped it would be a book that people could read if they, people without a background in academic philosophy could read if they really tried. But, it's hard work. A lot of it is very technical. I mean, it sold far more copies than I ever could have expected because of some coverage out there in the media and so on. I don't know how many of those copies remained mostly unread on coffee tables. This book I'm really trying to get people to read it, really going to town on making it accessible.
I mean, that's one thing I would stress about the book, that it is very easy to read. It is very accessible indeed. It goes through some quite difficult stuff, but it does it in a very friendly way. It is unlike most philosophy books. If you're someone who's not accustomed to reading philosophy, finds philosophy a bit off-putting, you won't find this off-putting. It's
also, I thought, at first I got it, I thought, God, this is huge. But actually, the main argument is kind of in the first 4 sections. So that's the kind of a short book length is the main argument, and then you've got these different sections on what you want to go into. This, on value or the mind, or and then the final section, foundations, I guess, is slightly more technical. I think maybe professional philosophers or PhD students might find that final section most rewarding.
Yeah.
I kind of got a lot out of that. So it's don't be intimidated by the length of this. You can sort of pick which.
I also tried to do it so you don't have to read it in order. I found quite a lot of people.
Yeah.
Some people are really interested just in the value issues. It turns out you can go straight to the value section and read that. So yeah, lots of different. Yeah, go on.
People shouldn't let that deceive them, though. Sometimes I think people who write clearly, they're sometimes written off as being a bit shallow. This isn't shallow at all. It deals with some very deep stuff, and so clouded. Sometimes I think that philosophers who write in an obscure way get more attention because people think there are great depths there that they can spend their time trying to interpret, and clarity is compatible with depth.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I actually think, I know people, first reaction, they see a book like this, it's got illustrations and so on. Oh, okay, maybe I can't quite be the illustrations are amazing. Do your favorite thought experiments.
Absolutely.
Illustrated. But actually, my view is this is my most serious book. This is my most, I don't know, people can't rate it's kind of odd to rate the importance of your own work, but I think this is my most important book, most philosophically serious. The fact that it happens to be done in an accessible style. Well, I just think I'd like to think those things can be compatible. So at least my aim was to try and write something totally substantial and also totally accessible. I mean, who's to say whether I succeeded in that? Because I think some great. There are a few role models out there, like someone like Dan Dennett is wonderful at doing this, or Peter Singer, Martha Nussbaum, and so on. I've always admired people like that, and I've tried to learn lessons from philosophical authors like that in writing this.
It's a great example to set, I think. Too many philosophers just write for other philosophers, and the disciplines. If we think the discipline's as important as we do, then we shouldn't just be talking to each other.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I was just going to go, Philip.
The plan is, I think we're going to do some, the general introductory questions we do to all our guests. And then we're going to spend some time on classic Chalmers, have a little chat about the hard problem of consciousness, which is, we are Mind Chat. We are a consciousness podcast primarily. And then we're going to move on to the book, spend some time chatting about that. And then we're going to have some audience participation, audience questions towards the end. Okay. So at this point, I will hand over to my beautiful co-host, Keith, for who on earth is David Chalmers?
Okay. Well, Dave, is it that you're writing about consciousness? I mean, I guess as children, a lot of us, I suppose, think about the mind and puzzle a bit over the mind, but most of us, I suppose, kind of grow out of that and just go on and just accept the wonder of their own minds and just inhabit the world without questioning it too much. But philosophers don't grow out of that habit. In fact, they go deeper and deeper into this. What was your own route into thinking about consciousness? I know you started as a mathematician.
Yeah, I was very much a math and science geek throughout most of my teenage years. I was in maths competitions and went to the mathematical Olympiad, and always thought I was going to become a mathematician. I read a whole lot of science, and so I didn't know very much about philosophy. Probably, I don't know what the first philosophy book I read was. I read Gödel, Escher, Bach by Douglas Hofstadter, which came out when I was about 12 or so, and which covered mathematics and logic and art and music, but at its deep roots was kind of a very philosophical work of thinking about intelligence and consciousness and AI, and that was very influential for me. I guess I had some experiences that got me thinking about consciousness, in retrospect, at least, one way or another. One was that I actually experienced synesthesia as a child. I had music color synesthesia, which meant I'd hear a song, say, on the radio, and I would experience that as having a certain color. Sometimes, occasionally a really interesting color, like bright red, mostly kind of dull colors, like brown and dark green. Things would kind of mix in together. But that kind of seemed normal to me. But in retrospect, it was like, okay, well, what is it with these? It disappeared at a certain point. It went away when I was about 20, and I'm like, okay, songs don't have colors anymore. What happened? And maybe that got me thinking a little bit about some of the peculiar qualities of experience. One thing I wrote about way back in my first book was getting glasses when I was 10 years old. I had monocular vision. Roughly one eye was very blurry, very short-sighted. The other eye was perfectly good. The world already seemed the world seemed fine to me. I thought I saw it sharply. It seemed three-dimensional. But then I put on glasses and suddenly, whoo, the world just popped out into 3D. I thought, wow, what just happened? Well, there's some story I could tell about the processes, where now the brain is getting different information from both eyes that's brought together to give it information about depth. I mean, I understood that, but why did that give us this subjective feeling? It's this subjective pop out. What's happening there? That seems to be something different from all that processing. And yeah, how could that even happen? And in retrospect, that's a kind of a version of the problem of consciousness. How does all this processing give you the subjective experience? But yeah, I went to university to study maths. Never know whether to call it maths or math, because back then I called it maths. These days I call it math.
It's plural. It's plural. It should be maths.
To respect you guys and and perhaps your predominantly European audience. I don't know. Is it true, or do you have a?
It's plural in Greek, mathematica. Okay. So that will do for me.
We don't say yeah. Okay, it's physics. It's maths. Okay. Trying to think of another example, but okay, yeah, maths. I took one course in philosophy in my first year. Didn't do very well. I got what we call distinctions for everything in my undergraduate course, but just a credit for philosophy, like a B. And yeah, the lecturers weren't too impressed by my amazing philosophical thinking. But there was one more unit on the mind-body problem, philosophy of mind, taught by Chris Mortensen, who's a logician at the University of Adelaide. Somehow that got me thinking about the mind and about consciousness, as did reading. I read the Hofstadter and Dennett book, The Mind's Eye. That was also wonderful for getting into some of these ideas in a really accessible way. And around a certain point, it just came to seem to me that this thing, consciousness, is actually the most mysterious thing, most mysterious and interesting thing in the universe. It's the thing we don't understand right now. I was doing math and physics were, they were cool, but like, it seemed like, okay, a lot of the hardest problems were now well understood. Would have been very exciting to be doing those things a few hundred years ago. Now, well understood. What is now so ill understood? It seemed to me like the mind in general and consciousness in particular seemed to be like the single most mysterious thing in the world. And I just gradually became obsessed by thinking about consciousness. And that was a long story from there, how I actually ended up getting into academic philosophy. But that was probably where the seeds were planted.
I think that links nicely to what we were going to ask next, which is why do you think it's important specifically for philosophers to think about consciousness? So yeah, sure, there is a deep mystery here, perhaps one of the few remaining deep mysteries, but I guess a lot of people would think, well, isn't it a scientific question? Shouldn't we just get on with the neuroscience, the cognitive science? Well, what is the role of philosophers in thinking about consciousness, do you think?
Well, I'd like to think it's in principle a scientific problem that we'll ultimately have a science of, but there are some things that science isn't quite ready for yet. At least the science of consciousness right now isn't just is not fully addressing a number of the central questions of fully explaining consciousness. That might be because it's premature. Science will get their We'll get there one day, but someone's got to be thinking about these problems. I don't care very much whether it's philosophers or scientists, but it turns out there are questions about consciousness that you can't right now address by going into a lab and doing experiments. So that makes it at least this turns out to be a place where philosophers and their distinctive tools have something to contribute. And of course, this isn't new. There are so many problems that start out as philosophy and end up as science. Newton thought of himself as a philosopher, but figured out some ways to think about space and time rigorously enough that by the time he was done, we were on the way to a science. It's happened again and again, psychology and economics. So I think consciousness is somewhere in the middle of all that right now. Some bits of the problem have moved from philosophy into science, but there are still so many central questions, including, if you talk about the hard problem of consciousness to a scientist, I think most of them, or at least, probably a majority, at least recognize the problem and in some sense take it seriously, but they'll also say, well, that's just, right now, that's not a scientific problem, or right now, that's something that's very difficult to approach through the science. So, okay, if you want to be thinking about that in a rigorous way, right now, philosophical methods are one of the best ways to do so. Now, it may not be the case forever. I mean, it's an interesting question whether they'll end up. Some of these problems will, even for space and time, there are still philosophical problems about space and time that are the provenance of, say, the philosopher of physics, as opposed to the provenance of physics. So I think, maybe there'll remain some problems that are distinctively philosophical. But that line gradually moves over time as things move to philosophy and science. If it turns out in 100 years that there's a scientific framework for really addressing the hard problem of consciousness, well, fantastic.
Right. And of course, one of the issues is, whether there really is a hard problem. We're still fighting over the explanandum as well, I think, in philosophy of consciousness. We do this thing where, I'm sorry, that's just getting my 2 cents in there. Where
he can't help himself.
I can't help I can't.
Wait, hold fire.
I don't. Look, let's do our thing. We have a quick fire round, don't we? Where we just, I think it's, the idea is just so that our listeners can get an idea of where you're coming from on a range of things. So we ask a few quick fire questions. So I know all of these take you deeply into the stuff you discuss in the book, but just a brief outline to begin with. So, God, does God exist?
By the way, you've got 30 seconds for each answer.
Okay. I think of myself as,
a little bit longer.
Can I restart the clock, please?
Yeah, you can have a little bit longer than that. Just
very good. Yeah. I think of myself as an atheist. Yeah, growing up, I was never inclined to believe in a God. And I'm still mostly inclined in that direction. I'm a naturalist. I think that, the world is ultimately subject to natural laws and ought to be explainable by them. That said, ever since I started entertaining the idea the universe could be a simulation, then maybe it offers a new route to thinking about godlike creatures. If we're in a simulation, who's our creator? Well, maybe it's the person who started the simulation, the simulator. They could even be all-powerful and all-knowing with respect to our universe. So, boy, maybe here is a naturalistic, potentially a route to something a little bit like a God that's consistent with science. At the same time, I don't recommend setting up a religion around this creature. No particular reason to think that whoever created our simulation is all good or all wise or has any moral insight. So this would be very much a watered down God. A God that even a naturalist, a God that even an atheist could love.
Right. And it's a God that you come to not through religion or through faith or through religious experience, but through science.
Indeed, science, philosophy. Yeah, I don't want to say that, and through technology, but through reflecting on certain ways a perfectly ordinary world could be and what simulation technology could do, that kind of leads you to at least to take seriously the possibility that all this could be a simulation, which then entails that there's another universe containing the simulation. Somehow the simulation got set up, and that's okay. It's at least got interesting structural analogies with some theistic ideas. It certainly doesn't bring in all the elements of traditional religion, but the structural analogies are interesting.
Okay, that's God. What about free will?
I'm confused about free will. I've never really had serious, well-developed views about free will. Part of me says, well, it depends on what you mean by free will. Classic philosopher's response, especially in this domain. If you mean by free will the ability to say to do what you want, which I think a lot of the time is what we care about in talking about whether someone is free, then I think, you know, we can certainly have that. Now, someone will come back and say, but what you want, that was determined. You didn't have like free choice over that. I'm like, well, do I want that? Do I want to have free choice over what I want? But yeah, if by free will, on the other hand, you mean the ability to do anything in principle, totally unconstrained by the past, then I think, yeah, we probably don't have that. So part of the question, I always liked Dan Dennett's phrase, the subtitle to his book Elbow Room, which was Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting.
Worth wanting, yes.
What's the kind of free will we really care about and want the most? Maybe, for example, like the ability to do what we want. Well, at least we have that.
Absolutely. I'm genuinely puzzled as to why some people want more. They definitely do, and it's deeply important to them. But maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe it's the influence of religion. I'm not sure. Right.
You're getting into the debate again.
Wait, and
we're not allowed to do this in quickfire.
Sorry, he's not allowed.
We're not allowed to debate in quickfire. Is that right?
No.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Quickfire is not crossfire.
That's strike two. I'm gonna kick you out.
Sorry. I don't normally do the quickfire ones. It's not anyway. Objective morality.
Oh boy, I'm confused about that one too. I guess I think of myself as probably moral anti-realist, thinking that morality is ultimately what we take to be morality. Ultimately, comes down to some attitudes that have been programmed into us, and that we then reflect on and try to systematize. But there are some threads I find that goes the other way, especially when it comes to value, and also the connection to consciousness. I guess I'm inclined to think, consciousness actually has some intrinsic value. But,
Right.
Certain states of consciousness are very good. Other states of consciousness are much worse, like pain. Is that just a matter of my attitudes towards them? I don't know. I'm not sure that totally rings true. There's a part of me that wants to say, no, pain is just intrinsically and objectively bad, and other states of consciousness, like fulfillment, whatever, are intrinsically and objectively good. Yeah, going on there at least leads in the direction of some kind of objectivity, at least about value, which isn't yet objectivity about morality. But once you've got that much objectivity, you might think it's a relatively small step to objectivity about morality too. So yeah, count me as confused on this one as well.
I seem to remember making a little bit of progress persuading you of this a while back with, someone who dedicates their life to counting blades of grass. That's a sort of pointless way of spending time, or did I dream that? Maybe I dreamt that.
If they really want to count blades of grass, then yeah, it's kind of a meaningful and valuable life for them. But yeah, maybe there are other lives that are more meaningful despite satisfying desires equally. So yeah, meaning and value are themselves interestingly connected. Maybe meaning requires value, but there could be lives which are somehow equal in value, but one carries more meaning. Yeah, hard to say.
Right. Okay. That's the quick fire questions. Philip now.
Very good. So I guess we'll move to some more substantive discussion of the standard thing on Mind Chat, as I was sort of saying before we went live, is we have on a materialist guest, and Keith and the materialist guest gang up on me and kind of bully me for a couple of hours. So I'm very pleased to finally have someone on my side of the debate. So,
really? I'm the first ever on the show
No. Our first guest was a dualist.
Tim O'Connor was our first guest, yeah. So that was
we've had Helen Yetta Chapel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
very
I'm
good.
exaggerating. Oh no, I'm not. You're right. But so why do you think materialism is such a stupid view, Dave, and so obviously wrong, and what is it that totally rules it out? And
I love materialism. I grew up a materialist. Deep down,
what? You're supposed to be on my side.
I love it. It turns out to be wrong. It's such a beautiful view of the world that everything is physical, and yeah, and it's just physical and what follows from that. It's such a simple view of the world, austere yet powerful. It can explain such a wide variety of phenomena. We've got this beautiful explanatory chain where physics explains chemistry, which explains biology, and so on from there. The question is just, can it explain consciousness? And I've come to the view, I came to the view, I guess, quite a while ago now, that ultimately, yeah, the structure of, say, physical theories places limits on what it can explain. You know, so one way to come at this roughly and intuitively is that physical theories are wonderful for explaining certain things. Let's restrict it to the human mind and things in the vicinity. Physical theories are wonderful at explaining the things we do. So, say, neuroscience and cognitive science can very well set up to explain our behaviors and our behavioral capacities and our responses to the world by specifying, say, a physical mechanism and show how it can play a certain role, which turns out to be pretty much what you need for so many problems throughout the world. You can get most of biology and most of chemistry and a whole lot of psychology fits under that paradigm. But when it comes to the problem of consciousness, the problem just doesn't seem to have that form. So here's where I distinguish between the easy problems of consciousness, which are roughly problems of explaining certain things that we do and certain kinds of responses. We distinguish stimuli in the environment, we integrate information, we report, we have control over our behavior. But the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of subjective experience. Why does it feel like something when all this processing goes on, and vision, perception, thinking, acting? Why is there something it's like from the first person point of view to undergo these states? And that doesn't seem to be a problem about how it is that various functions and so on are performed. One way to bring that out is it seems like, you can in principle imagine explaining all of these things, discrimination, integration, report, the things we say, the things we do. And there still may be this further question. Yes, but why is all that accompanied by subjective experience? That's the hard problem. And I guess it came to seem to me that materialism in principle was set up by its nature to explain the easy problems, but it's always going to leave a gap for the hard problem.
Well, that all sounds completely obviously correct and undeniable, and so I don't think anyone could disagree with that. Should we move on to the next discussion? You think? I don't know. Or do you have anything to say?
I'm sure Dave is happy that there are people who, as at least exploring the hypothesis that maybe the hard problem is just a cluster of interconnected easy problems, which give the appearance of being a hard problem. He doesn't believe that, but I'm sure he would like there to be people who are exploring that possibility and trying to see if it can be decomposed into easy problems. And that's all really that I see. I'm trying to do. The idea of the illusion is that the idea is the hard problem is an illusion. And I mean, we'll come back to this, I'm sure, later. But in the book, I'm really on board with everything in the book, pretty much, and I'm on board in we'll come to this later, but small lowercase f free will, lowercase c colors, and so on, lowercase c consciousness. We just got to be structural realists about consciousness as well, and I think that's entirely in the spirit of Dave's book and Dave's view generally. And I'm sure that there's a world where the close parallel world where there's a Dave Chalmers exploring this view with the passion and intelligence that our Dave Chalmers has brought to exploring the hard problem. So I'm just trying to assist that Dave Chalmers.
Yeah. No, I totally respect the strategy of trying to turn the hard problem into a series of easy problems. The hard problem is hard enough that you know, on record saying this requires crazy ideas to solve it. And hey, maybe one of those crazy ideas is, well, actually, there is no hard problem after all, or there is nothing here to explain. I mean, it sounds nuts, but so does panpsychism. We got nuts. We got panpsychism. It's nuts. We got illusionism. It's nuts. Which is more nuts? So I totally respect the strategy. I mean, sometimes in some people's hands, that can just be kind of a vague thing. Oh yeah, once we explain a bunch of stuff, the hard problem will go away. And I've never found that terribly compelling, even though, okay, maybe it's true. I'm interested in specific strategies. But yeah, so the one strategy that I really respect here on the materialist side of the equation is the one that you, Keith, have advocated in great depth, which is the so-called illusionist strategy of saying, okay, instead of just trying straight out to explain consciousness, that's the hard problem, rather what we'll do is try and explain the things we say about consciousness and maybe the things we believe about consciousness. This is what I've called the meta problem of consciousness. Keith called it the illusion problem.
But your suggestion.
It's true. It's true. I carry some blame here. Back in the days when we were cruising around Greenland talking about illusionism a lot, Keith had a paper called the magic problem originally.
It did. That's right.
And I said, that's going to confuse people calling it the magic problem. Why do you call it the illusion problem? Absolutely. And that's a great title. But the trouble is, then that's not a name that I can use because I don't believe consciousness is an illusion. But I think this problem is very important, even for somebody like me. The problem of explaining why it is that we say the things we do about consciousness. That's a problem for anyone. We might give different explanations. But I can't call that the illusion problem because I don't think it's an illusion. So that's where I said, okay, I'll have to call this the meta problem.
Can you say a bit more, Dave, about why that would be a problem for people who might not be? Why it would be a problem to explain how our talk about consciousness and.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just remember the distinction between the hard problem explaining subjective experience and the easy problem explaining the things we do. Turns out that among the many things we do, among the many objective behaviors, for example, that we exhibit, is saying things about consciousness. Now, among the three of us, we kind of do this nonstop, constantly, writing, saying things. Here we are having a conversation about it. We write things about it, books and articles, and even ordinary people will at least, a decent amount of the time say things about consciousness. All these things we say about consciousness, those are basically behaviors. So it falls under the heading of the easy problem. Easy, in principle, it looks like there ought to be physical explanations of these things that we say. And you might say, okay, fine, that's an easy problem. It's not the hard problem. But you might take the view that once we've explained all the things we say about consciousness, like I am consciousness, consciousness seems puzzling to me, consciousness is irreducible to the physical, there's something else needs explaining. If we explain why we say and maybe why we believe all those things, then that might make the hard problem disappear and dissolve. And that's what I understand Keith's view to be. By first, solve the meta problem, explain all these things that we say and that we believe. Once we've solved the meta problem, then maybe the hard problem somehow goes away. A theist might say, explain God. And someone else, an atheist, says, well, I can't explain God, but I can explain why you believe in God. And that's a very powerful strategy. It may not remove every mystery in the domain of God, but it's certainly a very powerful strategy. So I respect this as a philosophical strategy in general. And there's a whole literature on this kind of strategy now. People talk about debunking arguments, debunking arguments not to directly argue there's not a God, but to debunk, the source of your belief in God. Also called these genealogical arguments. Look at where these beliefs come from. People have applied it to God, to morality. So what I see Keith and other illusionists is doing is applying that debunking strategy to consciousness. Now, that's a fascinating, super interesting strategy. And I like it one reason I like it compared to other materialist strategies is it really does take the hard problem seriously, at least to a considerable extent. It acknowledges there's a very, very gripping sense here that we're conscious, that there's something that needs explaining, and then just tries to explain that away. I mean, people do, you know, a lot of people still have their reaction. There's something a little bit extreme and crazy about illusionism, because at least on one way of understanding it, so-called strong illusionism, it ultimately has to deny that, you know, we are actually conscious in the sense that we start talking about here. The strong illusionism denies that we have subjective experience, denies that there's something that's like to be. Many people think that's just kind of, well, now you're just denying the most obvious thing in the world. As Galen Strawson says, this is the most absurd thing anyone ever said. I don't know. I don't find it so absurd. I think it's a view worth exploring, but it does have the sense of being kind of contrary to really fundamental data. But that's probably ultimately the main reason I reject it, because I find the view literally unbelievable. It seems to be a datum that we're conscious. On the other hand, the view does have the bonus feature of explaining, you know, at least once, if it gets worked out properly, it could explain why I find it unbelievable. So, you know, the dialectic here is complex, and I certainly respect the view.
And we can have a revised, deflated notion of consciousness, small lowercase consciousness, a concept that does a lot of the work, a lot of the work worth doing that the inflated capital C concept of capital C consciousness did. You know, very much in the way that we can with free will. So I don't think we have to cast out the baby with the bathwater. But maybe this is something we'll get back to later as we.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's small c consciousness is a interesting strategy, and maybe there's something left. But I do think it's worth appreciating how much of the ordinary kind of common sense, introspective intuitions about consciousness you lose. I mean, I've noticed there's this thing that happens with illusionists. Sometimes they start off saying, it looks like putting forward a view where they say, there's no such thing as consciousness. And this thing that seems to exist doesn't really exist. And then people look at them a bit funny, like they're saying something extreme. And then they kind of retreat into saying something that sounds, oh, no, I'm not really saying that you're not conscious. I'm saying consciousness isn't quite the way you thought it was. I mean, this happened. Dan Dennett went through this evolution back in the 1980s. He wrote articles with titles like "On the Absence of Phenomenology." This thing that seems to be there really isn't there at all, and people look at him like he was crazy. And then, from the 1990s onwards, he never really made a very clear statement of strong illusionism anymore. So I think there are these things called philosophers talk about these things called qualia. That's a philosopher's construct. I reject the philosopher's construct. I think it's very different to say you're rejecting a philosopher's construct to saying, this sense that we all have of consciousness, that's an illusion. And my own view is that for strong illusionism to work, it has to reject something which seems totally obvious to almost everyone. And maybe even in your case, Keith, I've occasionally seen some backsliding here. I'm not rejecting the common sense thing. I'm just rejecting a philosopher's theory of that thing. And my view is that the kind of illusionism to really do the work of undercutting the powerful intuitions, it can't just be reflecting a philosopher's theory. It has to be rejecting something that runs deep in all of us.
I recognize that what you're talking about there, and I recognize it in myself. And I think it's. I don't want to take too much. We need to get onto your book, but I mean, there's certain things I'm quite happy to say. I mean, I'm quite happy to do a sort of demonstrative demo. This state I'm in now, whatever it is, something's happening now. That's real, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not characterizing that in any way that creates a hard problem. It's just whatever it is. And I can pick out states similar to this in some relevant way, which I'm not sure how to articulate, and contrast them with other states, sort of subliminal kinds of perceptions. So on. And I can get a sort of grip on the range of cases we're talking about without committing to anything that I think poses a hard problem. And I can say things about these states that I can recognize them when I have them, and I can compare them to each other, and I can say whether I like being in them or not, whether I, I desire them to continue. And I can say all these, there's lots of things I can say here without saying anything that is not capturable in a, the standard sort of functionalist way. So I think I can go quite a long way to getting a grip on an explanandum, an intuitive grip on an explanandum that corresponds to at least central elements in what we ordinarily think of as consciousness, without introducing something that creates, without starting to talk about the lights being on or there being something it's like and these kind of things. And I think so. But as I say, I don't want to.
Well, I think we can, Keith. I think we can debate. I think we're
okay. Well, yeah, that's my strategy. I would sort of demonstrably identify a range of cases, contrast them with cases like subliminal perception, and say it's what they all have in common. What's characteristic about those? And it's quite possible that it seems that what's characteristic about them all is that they involve a certain sort of global information broadcast or something or whatever.
Why isn't that enough, Dave?
That to me sounds like, that's a totally respectable, boring materialist strategy, but it just seems to me it's lost what's interesting about illusionism, which is the claim that we're all subject to this really pervasive illusion.
The illusion is that there's something more.
For illusionism to really succeed in undercutting the hard problem, the form I like anyway acknowledges that there's something that seems incredibly obvious to exist. It seems totally obvious that these states exist. If they exist, they generate all these problems. But then they say, no, those states do not exist. There's something that seems introspectively overwhelmingly obvious that's in fact false. And I don't see this. I don't see this view you're outlining so far as really retaining that core of illusion.
That was just giving a positive characterization of consciousness without in a small c consciousness. But yes, I do think there's something that. But I'm increasingly inclined not to link it specifically to introspection. It's qualities. I mean, the things that cause the problem are qualities, are colors, and I take the naive view to be that we're in Eden, that these things are painted on the world around us, and something's got to give with that. With that naive view, there are too many problems with it. And so one thing is to put them.
Do you want to just explain the Eden reference for people?
Oh, that's well. But Dave, let Dave explain that.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic with you when it comes to colors. I introduced this idea of Eden in thinking about color perception, where it seems to us that objects in the world have these special qualities of redness and greenness with a qualitative nature spread on the surface of objects. That's how it seems to us. But now it looks like science says, no such thing really exists. There's just things reflect the light that affects us in a certain way. And the conceit is, actually, well, back in the Garden of Eden, things really had those properties. Were capital R, and the apple was capital R red, and the grass was capital G green. And then there really were those qualities out there in the world. Then there was a fall from Eden. Nothing has those qualities anymore. But so the idea for me is these Edenic properties refer to the properties that seem to be out there, even though they may not. Special, primitive, qualitative properties. In the case of color, I like the illusionist strategy. I think, it's maybe we have the illusion that these qualities are out there, but they're not. So I see Keith is trying to extend that strategy to consciousness with the qualities.
Well, in a way, I mean, I think once you've said that they're not really out there, you've already made a very strong illusionist claim that is as counterintuitive as anything else that an illusionist might ever claim. Because if these things seem to be anywhere, they seem to be out there. They don't seem to be in my mind. Certainly don't seem to be in my brain. They seem to be out there around me. And as soon as you become an illusionist about external color, then I think you've already made, as far from the manifest image, from the common sense point of view, you've already made a very radical and hard to swallow claim. And so I think once you've made that, then we're kind of in the realm of theory. And one thing you can do is say, well, these colors aren't really out there, so where can they be? Well, they're certainly somewhere, so they must be in the mind. And then if you say the mind is really the brain, well, they somehow must be in the brain, and now you've really got a problem. Or you can say, well, they're not really anywhere. They're we are led to believe that they're out there, and we can tell some story about why this is. But it's this, again, we've mentioned him many times. It said the problem of conscience, the problem of what to do with colors once you realize they're not really out there in the world. And I think putting them in the mind is a theoretical strategy. It was easy to put them in the soul when people
It is interesting. People react very, very differently to the color case, to the consciousness case. In the case of colors, you can say to people, okay, yeah, well, the colors, they're not really out there in the object. And people are fine with it. Galileo went in, as Phil talked about, Galileo went this way. And what people end up saying is something like, well, of course, yeah, but if you still have the experience of the colors as being out there, and you just say, well, the datum here is not the colors, but our experience of them. And for most people, that seems to be totally fine, and they're on board with that. It doesn't seem radical. But when it comes to the question is, what does the illusionist do for consciousness? The illusionist says, "Oh, no, the way I understand the illusionist is they ought to say there's not even the experience of colors. There appears to be an experience of colors, but really all there is like a judgment that there's colors, and a judgment, maybe a judgment that we have the experience of colors, and so on." That, to most people, is just a much more radical and more difficult to view belief, because it is so overwhelmingly introspectively obvious that we have the experience of colors.
Well, it need to be something as one-dimensional as a judgment. It can be a whole raft of reactions, many psychological reactions, many of which we know kind of subliminal. It's an engagement with the world, of reacting to the world, having the world impact upon you in a certain way, which we characterize as experiencing red or whatever it might be. So it's much more, I think. I mean, what needs explaining as part of the meta problem isn't just us judging or saying this, but it's the whole complex raft of multi-dimensional reactions. So I think we've got to let us have a few more tools in our sort of workbox if we're going to create some adequate explanation here.
Fair enough. I just like there to be some illusionist out there who says this thing that seems overwhelmingly introspectively obvious to exist doesn't exist. I think at some moments in your writings you say that, but some of the time I see you occasionally drop in on you on Twitter, even though I don't post on Twitter. See what's going on. It's like, no, I'm not saying anything. On Twitter. What's that?
Even though you don't have a Twitter account, you're omnipresent on Twitter.
I
actually have a Twitter account. I just never post, but I follow people. Like,
okay. Sorry,
I'm quite. I mean, I'm quite happy to say that the red that appears to be out there painted on the spine of the book in front of me isn't out there on the spine of the book, and it isn't in my brain either. It isn't anywhere else. It's my talk about the red is a consequence of my interacting with the physical features of the book in a certain way. I'm quite happy to say that.
So to defend, I wanted to gang up on you, Keith, but to defend Keith, I suppose Dave's charge is this is like weakling illusionism. This isn't hardcore illusionism, but I suppose that the sense in which it's illusionism is that, well, what Keith just said, really, the qualities don't exist anywhere. They don't exist out there in the world. They don't. So that is still. So it's not saying consciousness doesn't exist. It's not saying no one's ever felt pain or seen red. Keith, I think I described Keith's view in my book as saying no one's ever felt pain, and Keith corrected me on that. That's the impression I got from his classic article.
I would like to find an illusionist who comes out and says no one has ever experienced pain. Maybe they undergo pain and they blah blah blah, but no one has ever experienced pain. Yes, we totally seem overwhelmingly introspectively obvious we do, but we don't.
But you've got to let me make a distinction between capital P pain and little p pain. Just as, I mean, a believer in libertarian free will might say, well, look, you're saying there's little f free will, but hey, there's no such thing. You're just flat out denying free will, and you've got to allow me that. I mean, you can say that small c consciousness isn't real consciousness, and that I know, but I mean, it's not that if you don't let me make that distinction, then it's just hardcore realism or flat out eliminativism and nothing in between.
That's reasonable. Maybe we could also do capital E experience versus lowercase e experience, which I think is really probably going to be at the crux of the matter. But it's just the one thing. But I just think that for that strategy to be worked, it has to be combined with the idea that capital E experience is the thing that totally obviously seems to exist from the inside, and you then go on to deny it, rather than the strategy. Capital E experience is just something that some philosophers believe in.
I'm quite happy to say this, that capital E experience is something that I mean, I think most of the time we're just sort of in the world. We're not introspecting. We're not really in our heads, in our own experiences. We're in the world, and the sort of medium just drops out of it. And it's only by a certain kind of reflection that you get this sense of there being an experiential medium. But I'm quite happy to say that there is a way of introspecting and conceptualizing what's happening, where it can seem absolutely bedrock datum that there is some sort of experiential medium here. And I'm happy to say that that's an illusion, but I don't think it. I think it requires a certain sort of theoretical priming and a certain kind of attention to your introspective attention to get yourself in that state. But I agree, once you get yourself in it, it can seem absolutely uncontrovertible. Yeah, okay, and I am controverting it.
As long as you're still a card-carrying, I just want to make sure you stay as card-carrying, strong illusionist as opposed to the weak illusionist. It's conscious. It's just a bit different.
Weak illusion. I think one thing we're on absolutely the same page is that we've no time for identity, brute identity theories. I'm happy to be a token identity theorist via functionalism, but brute identity theories just don't have any appeal to me at all. I don't think they make any sense. They don't take the hard problem seriously, and they're just inelegant and arbitrary.
I see Richard Brown. I see Richard Brown saying in the chat that Francois Cameron is the closest to that. I think it's right. Francois he's kind of carrying the flag for really strong, uncompromising illusionism, and I admire that. And Keith is close, but occasional elements of backsliding.
Francois Camera's got this paper on pain, and how we think about morality, given that no one's felt pain. And he does see, I think he slightly makes the qualification capital P pain, small p pain, but he is happy to say in an ordinary way we think about pain, nobody's ever felt pain. So that's pretty hardcore, I think.
I think there's an open question what we do think of as the ordinary way as well. I mean, there's X-Fi work done on this. I'm not sure it's quite as clear as people in our tradition take it to be.
I agree, and there is room for a lot of interesting experimental. There is room for a lot of really interesting experimental philosophy here on what ordinary people's intuitions actually are, and I think some of that's starting to be done now, and that's super interesting offshoot, I think, of this program.
And I think there's a lot here that we absolutely agree on the need to address the meta problem, these X-Fi issues. There's a lot of stuff that we completely agree on, and what we could all work together on.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's one thing I like about the meta problem. There's a potentially fairly neutral research program that people can get into. And don't worry, Philip, it doesn't stop us from disagreeing and having all the.
This is too friendly. What is going on? This is too friendly. We're supposed to be getting revenge on Keith.
I just called Keith out for being for backsliding into wimpy illusionism.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, I think the working on the meta problem is a great idea, because different things might happen. We might find that we just can't solve the meta problem without positing some sort of something like strongly emergent phenomenal properties or something. We just can't solve it. Secondly, we might find that we can solve it to everyone's complete satisfaction, but that we still feel there's this powerful intuition that there's a hard problem, there's something more to explain. And then third, we might find that we can solve it to everyone's satisfaction, and that we just no longer feel that the hard problem has any grip on us. And we won't know till we get some progress on solving the problem. So it's working on the meta problem isn't biasing us towards any one particular outcome of. It's not saying not biases towards an illusionist outcome.
Yeah, and by the way, we don't seem to have a very good solution to the meta problem right now. It's a problem which I think ought to be solvable in principle, and materialist means. But it's interesting that there are a few solutions out there, but none of them strike me as terribly compelling, even on the meta problem's own terms. So there's room for a lot of interesting explanations, interesting work there. And once all that work is done, maybe all kinds of philosophical questions might look at least somewhat different.
I mean, there's Michael Graziano's work, for example, is one.
Just in case
I'm actually going down. So I'm giving a talk at Princeton on the meta problem in March. That Michael invited me down there. So hopefully we'll get to have a long discussion there. So I think he's got the idea of we'll solve the hard problem by addressing the meta problem, but what he actually has to say about the meta problem looks very thin to me. So I'm hoping that, but maybe he's been thinking about this further. So maybe there'll be some maybe
he's very much an illusionist, but he doesn't like the term.
He also backslides though. He says, "No, I don't want to call it an illusion." It's like, yeah, I think there really is awareness. It's just like this, and it's not like that. So yet another. Almost all these illusionists end up kind of saying, "I'm not really one of those illusionists. I just want an illusionist who comes out and says, I'm the strongest kind of illusionist."
But that's that's why consciousness is, perhaps the most difficult philosophical problem, isn't it? Because with all these other things like free will, value, mathematical objects, it's always an option to say maybe it just doesn't exist. But with consciousness, it's, very few people are willing to totally wholeheartedly say that.
Look, nobody's going to say that there's no difference between being sighted and being blind, or between being in pain and not being in pain. Nobody's going to say that. Being in the condition we call being in pain, whatever that is, or being sighted, whatever that is. Nobody's going to say that there's no difference. The question is, what is the difference? And so I can't see any motivation for saying there's no difference. The problem we have is explaining what the difference is and whether it's something that we captured in functional terms.
I mean, that seems to be sliding back to a sort of more a softer notion of consciousness. Like in all these debates, there's the three options, isn't there? There's like, it doesn't exist, it does exist, and it takes us beyond our normal scientific picture, or it does exist, but it can be accounted for in our normal scientific picture, right? And like on free will, as it doesn't exist, it does exist, or some compatibilist view. But it's just in the case of consciousness, the well, it doesn't exist option is
maybe the issue is about how we identify the explanandum. I mean, if the idea is that we identify purely introspectively, then maybe I'm quite happy to deny anything that we identify, because the way I characterize my explanandum, my small c consciousness, was essentially in third person terms as something that I can recognize, that I have certain abilities with respect to, and so on. So maybe that's the way, a purely private but then you see, in order to capture the thing that I'm denying, I've got to build in a bit like that it's purely private, that it's not capturable in functionalist terms and so on. So you've got to allow me to do a bit of that in order to establish what I'm denying. If it's just I'm denying that whatever's happening now is happening, well, of course I'm not. But you've got to allow me to build a bit in to have a target.
Right. So should we move on to?
Let's get on to the
book. I think
fantastic. My publisher would kill me.
We've solved all the problems of consciousness now. Yes. Let's move to yeah. Okay. So I guess the main argument's divided into two parts. So the first part is arguing that we don't know whether or not we're in a simulation. We don't know that we're not in a simulation. You're not, contrary to what some reporting has said, you're not saying we are in a simulation. Rather, it's a slightly more modest claim, but still quite radical, that we don't know that we're not in a simulation. So that's the first big claim. And then the second claim, even more interesting and striking in a way, is even if we are in a simulation, the physical world is still really there. Tables and chairs are real. Physics is still spot on. So maybe we could take each of those in turn. So maybe
can I just say, I think you've characterized half the book.
Oh,
the first half of the book is about the simulation idea, and yeah, we could be in a simulation, and if we are, all of it is real. But I think the second half of the book isn't about the simulation hypothesis. It's about virtual reality in a broader sense, and in particular, the kind of virtual reality technology we already have, and that's going to be developed in the coming decades. And there I want to argue, the first issue doesn't so much apply about knowledge. The second issue about reality does apply. And I want to argue that in virtual reality, the objects we're interacting with are real. They needn't be illusions or hallucinations. And then the third issue about value, which is one can actually lead a meaningful life and a good life in a virtual world. I mean, that does apply to the simulation idea, but I think it applies even more to coming VR. So I think of, if there are two big ideas, two big clusters of ideas, and the one is simulation, the other one is virtual reality. And to take the extreme version of both, according to the British newspapers, is that I say we're definitely in a simulation, And furthermore, we should all run and jump into VR as soon as possible, because it's so much better than the physical world. Okay, that's not quite what I say, but at least that's. But those are at least the general themes, just much more moderate versions of those claims.
I think that's very important, because it's people may be inclined to just write off the simulation hypothesis, but perhaps not on good grounds. Then that's one thing that you need to read the book for. But the stuff on virtual reality confronts us all in a very immediate way. Even if you're inclined to dismiss the simulation hypothesis out of hand, these questions about, for instance, about the ethics of actions in a virtual world. These are they're pressing right now, and they're going to get more and more pressing very soon. So I think the book is much more than just a piece of speculation on a metaphysical hypothesis. It's in many ways it's a practical handbook to how to cope with this world that we are all spending more and more of our time in. These worlds that we're spending more and more time in. So it's in a way it's the opposite of a abstract philosophical speculation. But
I found quite a few people reading the book have gone straight to the second half. Yeah. Okay, they don't care about simulation hypothesis for them, whatever, that abstract philosophy, still virtual reality technology, and so I think hopefully, I think the philosophy and the practical issues are very deeply connected, but different people can focus in different places.
But shall we talk a bit about the simulation hypothesis, though, to begin with? Because you do make quite a strong case of saying that it could be true, and maybe if you distribute the probabilities in the right way, it might be the most likely option. Could you just say a bit about that, please?
Yeah, I first start by arguing that we can't know for sure that we're not in a simulation. We can't rule it out, and this is kind of here the simulation hypothesis is kind of continuous with familiar hypotheses in philosophy, like the idea that could we be dreaming right now? It goes back to find that in many ancient traditions in India, China, and so on. Or Descartes' hypothesis: could an evil demon be fooling us right now? All this exists when none of it is real. And they're very familiar philosophical arguments that that we can't rule those things out, and we can't know for sure we're not in those situations. The simulation hypothesis is, to a certain extent, an updated illustration of this in light of modern technology. To some extent, it raises similar issues. Well, it'd be indistinguishable, so you could never know. And I do go through arguments like that, but I do think the fact that it's actually using kind of technology which actually exists, or development of technology that we know is coming, actually adds a couple of things to the argument philosophically. One, this is now, Descartes was always rather skeptical about relying on the evil demon argument, and so this is very far out. We have reason to believe there are any such things. But simulations were actually, simulation technology exists. Not yet full-scale universe simulations, but probably in a few decades or a century, we'll actually have this technology. So it's not actually becomes a live hypothesis, one that's actually consistent with what we know about our world. At least for many people, that gives it an extra degree of seriousness, and you can't simply dismiss it as a possibility that's too far away. Second, there's the kind of statistical argument we might be in a simulation that's first put forward by Nick Bostrom and Hans Moravec, roughly saying that actually in the history of the world there are going to be many, many simulated universes with many, many simulated beings under certain assumptions. We should expect there'll be actually more simulated beings than unsimulated beings, and maybe even more simulated beings with experiences, conscious experiences like mine. Now, you've got to make a couple of assumptions to get there, but they're not implausible. Given that much, if that holds, then most beings in the universe with conscious experiences like mine will be simulations. Then I say, okay, well, what are the odds that I'm one of the unsimulated ones? And there's at least a line of argument here that might get you to the conclusion that 99% likely that we're in the simulation. Now, because you do have to make a couple of assumptions to get there, like that simulated beings will be conscious, and that it's possible to make these simulations, and that civilizations that can make these civilizations will make them. So maybe that introduces some room for doubt. But I end up arguing that at one point, people say, can you put a number on this? I don't know, probably I shouldn't have put a number on it. But at one point I said, 50% for this assumption, 50% for this assumption, multiply it all out. Anyway, at least 25% chance we're in a simulation. So now I'm on the record in the book as saying 25% possibility we could be in a simulation.
This isn't really fair, but I like to pose questions sometimes in this way. I like to invoke the truth demon. The truth demon is someone who's a demon who's omniscient and likes trying to see if people are sincere. And so he or she puts a question to you and asks for your best guess at the truth. If you get it right, then you're fine. If you're not, they punish you in the most terrible possible way and all everything you love. So if the truth demon asked you, are we in a simulation right now? What would you say?
Risky.
It is risky. That's why it's not a very fair question.
I guess I'm probably going to go for no. I feel the 25% is probably not too far away from my gut feeling. I guess that's my gut feeling. I've got to go with the 75% and say no. What's
interesting here is that, I mean, you discuss sim blockers, potential observations we might make, facts about the world as we encounter it that would rule out its being a simulation. And you discuss these and say that, well, none of them are really, none of them are really convincing. But yet we have this powerful sense that it isn't a simulation. And so there's a sort of meta problem here. Why do we have that powerful sense, given that it seems we don't have good reasons for it? So there's a meta problem of that. But I think it's undoubtedly the case that we have it. And I think that's a very interesting psychological question in itself. Unless, of course, we're missing some sim blockers.
We have a strong psychological sense that the universe is not simulated?
That it's not simulated. Sorry, I shouldn't have said real, that it's physical, that it's not virtual.
On the other hand, quite a lot of people have the sense the universe was created by a god and that this reality may exist within a broader reality. So maybe that's a version of the, admittedly without the computer, but you wouldn't expect anyone to have innate ideas about computers, given that the technology was only invented relatively recently in human evolution.
That's true. That's true. And that's one of the interesting things about the way you present the simulation hypothesis in the book. You link it up to more traditional ideas, idealism, obviously, and ideas about creation.
So just on Keith's raising the issue of sim blockers. And I guess one of the big ones, so sim blockers are supposed to be things that would. What's the definition of a sim blocker, Dave? Go on. You should.
Roughly, a sim blocker is something that could prevent it from being the case that many simulations are built, even though it looks like it's possible in principle they could be built. So, for example, there are the two that Bostrom focuses on, which is we could all go extinct before we're able to build simulations, or we'll get there, but we'll choose not to. I think that maybe there are some other sim blockers worth thinking about. One interesting one is we'll create some simulations, but we'll create even more robots so that simulations will actually still be relatively rare in the grand scheme of things. And there are a few others, but that's the general idea of a sim blocker.
So one big one is maybe simulations wouldn't be conscious. Simulated human beings wouldn't, or animals wouldn't actually be conscious. I think a lot of people have that intuition that if it's just a computer simulation of my brain or something, it wouldn't really be conscious. And this is an interesting question for all sorts of reasons. For example, if you're thinking about the possibility that we'll one day be able to upload our minds onto the internet and survive death and, still talk to granny via email when her body's rotting in the ground. But of course, if a simulated brain, isn't really conscious, then this would be uploading my mind, would essentially be killing myself. Now, Dave, you got a really interesting argument that kind of goes back to The Conscious Mind, your 90s book, as to why you think you think at least, I guess that the main claim is at least if we gradually upload the mind, we gradually simulate the mind, the resulting simulation would be conscious. Could you share that with us, that argument?
Yeah, so first to put this into context, I think you're right that one of the key assumptions of the simulation argument is that simulated beings will be conscious. Bostrom, in his version of the argument, he makes this a an assumption. Interestingly, he doesn't build it into his conclusion. His conclusion is either we're probably in a simulation, or people will go extinct, or they'll choose not to make simulations. I would have thought, to be consistent, he's really got to put this other possibility in there too, or simulated beings won't be conscious. And he ought to at least have a four-way conclusion, and maybe even another one for simulated universes won't be possible, and so on. So in the book, I suggested a somewhat different way of dividing up the possibilities than Bostrom, with more possibilities here available. But you're right that simulated beings are conscious is basically required for the argument we're probably in a simulation to go through. If we could establish that simulated beings are not conscious, will not be conscious, then our consciousness would itself give us very good reason to reject at least one central version of the simulation hypothesis, which is what I call the pure simulation hypothesis, on which we are ourselves simulated beings inside a simulation. It would actually leave open another version of the hypothesis, what I call the impure sim hypothesis, or the biosim hypothesis. This is like the brain in that situation, where I'm a biological brain connected to a digital simulation. And that version of the simulation hypothesis, it doesn't require that I be simulated. It doesn't require that a simulated being be conscious. So I could still be a biological brain, like Neo in the Matrix, connected to a simulation. So that version would still be left open. But, I don't know, I guess complex. Then is that the likely version of simulations? How likely is it that many impure simulations will be built? So so it gets a little complex there. But at least for the core, the most familiar version of the simulation hypothesis, the pure simulation, does require that simulated beings be conscious. And then, as you say, I have an argument that digital beings, simulated beings, can, in principle, be conscious. And this goes way back to the conscious mind, where I called it the fading qualia argument and the associated dancing qualia argument. And it's still basically a version of the same thing. And it's an argument that goes through gradually transforming your brain from a biological brain to a digital brain by, for example, replacing your neurons one at a time by silicon chip equivalents that interact with the neurons around them in exactly as a neuron does. So you first replace 1, then 10, then 100, 1,000, 1% of the brain, 10% of the brain, 50%, and so on. In the book, I call this gradual uploading, because it also serves to be gradually uploading yourself to a digital system, perhaps in the cloud. And what I try to argue is, if you went through that process and you're conscious at the beginning, you should still be conscious at the end. And the argument is kind of by reductio ad absurdum, that if we're not conscious at the end, then consciousness is going to have to disappear somewhere along the way. And there's only two possibilities. One is it gradually fades out. You're half conscious, quarter conscious, and so on. Even though, by hypothesis, these silicon chips are functionally identical to neurons. So your behavior will still be just the same, but your consciousness will gradually fade out. Or alternatively, your consciousness will suddenly disappear at a certain point. You'll go from full consciousness to no consciousness. And I think I try to argue, and what's written about this is both of those hypotheses, they're logically possible, but they're both very, very implausible in certain ways. And I try to argue that by far the most natural and plausible hypothesis is that consciousness stays present throughout. If so, that gets us at least to the idea that a silicon isomorph of us would be conscious. And from there, I think it's not too hard to go from a silicon isomorph to something like a brain simulation, as on the simulation hypothesis, and get us to simulated brains being conscious too.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and kind of partly in preparation for this, and it seems to me that there's perhaps an implicit premise in there that all of my behavior is reducible to underlying chemistry and physics. That seems necessary, because then the idea is, as long as you simulate all the physics of my body and brain, then you get all the same behavior. So in other words, we're assuming that there is no strong emergence. So Mind Chat regular viewers will know this is one of the things we debated endlessly with Sean Carroll, whether we can rule out the possibility of strong emergence, kind of maybe causal dynamics maybe in the brain that are not reducible to underlying chemistry or physics. So that seems, correct me if I'm wrong in a moment, an implicit assumption of this argument. But then I thought, well, maybe, because I do find something convincing about this argument, but maybe we could run it in the other direction. So so if the argument is, you can kind of think of as saying, you know, if there's no strong emergence, then simulations would be conscious. But maybe if for whatever reason we think, and a lot of people do have this intuition that a computer simulated brain wouldn't really be conscious. So if that's your starting point, maybe you could run the argument backwards and say, well, there must be strong emergence, right? Because if that's the crucial or a crucial starting point of the argument. So what do you think about that possibility of running the argument in the other direction?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, in general, one assumption of this argument is that at least, say, behavior can in principle be simulated, or behavior is generated by a bunch of components like neurons, whose behavior individually and collectively can be simulated. And yeah, there's various ways to deny that. One is to take the kind of Roger Penrose style strategy that maybe even there's something in physics or biology which is not computable. Then you wouldn't be able to simulate the brain, at least on a digital computer. In that case, I would still think maybe you could simulate the brain on a quantum computer or the quantum gravity computers in the future that might exploit Penrose's non-computable processes. So that would only be so limited. But the other possibility is that some form of interactionist dualism is true, and say consciousness has irreducible causal powers that aren't grounded in the causal powers of physics. Maybe there's a consciousness associated force, or maybe consciousness collapses the wave function in quantum mechanics. Yet if something like that is true, then there's no guarantee that replacing neurons by silicon chips is going to preserve that. I mean, I don't know quite why it wouldn't. It's certainly consistent with the idea that consciousness plays this irreducible causal role, that consciousness doesn't care whether it's interacting with neurons or with silicon chips. I'd like to think that, if I replace these neurons by silicon chips, then my consciousness will still be there playing its causal role, and it can push the silicon chips around in the same way it pushes the neurons around. But yeah, maybe there's some special. So there would have to be some interesting connection between this irreducible causal role and biology. But you're right. I mean, if there was some such, then it might just happen that as you replace the neurons by silicon chips, then consciousness starts interacting with all that in a somewhat different way, and it gave the neurons an amazing oomph that allowed us to do all these intelligent things, and it'll just be more bored with the silicon chips, and our behavior will gradually degrade till you get to the other end. The pure silicon chip system won't have it. Maybe all of our amazing mind-like behaviors will be gone. That's kind of the scenario you have in mind?
Well, I mean, just to make it more concrete, I mean, I suppose it's a crucial part of your argument is that as you're slowly replacing my neurons with simulations, I won't behave any differently. I won't say, oh, my consciousness is changing. But maybe, I mean, it seems an open possibility to me that, if maybe as you start to do this, there is some spontaneous reaction to it that is not totally predicted by the underlying chemistry and physics, that you would say, oh my God, things are changing. And maybe with conscious creatures, the way they react, I mean, especially, I guess, if you believe in libertarian free will or something, but I don't think that's the only possibility. If conscious creatures just spontaneously react to their consciousness in a way that is not reducible entirely to underlying physics and chemistry, then I think the argument's gonna fall apart, isn't it? Because you start replacing neurons and with simulations, they'll go, oh my God, what's going on? So I mean, so what I'm saying is there's a sort of choice here. We can go either way. If we start from the assumption that for independent reasons, you think a simulation isn't conscious. I mean, part of the reason for me, I guess, is as a panpsychist, not a dualist, as a panpsychist where consciousness is the stuff of matter, then it seems weird if consciousness goes along with computation, which is a sort of software issue. I mean, this is not a knockdown argument, but if you think of computation and simulation as sort of software, whereas the panpsychist thinks consciousness is the sort of hardware, the stuff of the world, then it would be weird if the hardware, i.e. consciousness, went along with computational facts. So if I start from that assumption and I run your argument backwards, then I could reach the conclusion that maybe there's strong emergence. Maybe as you start to simulate my brain, I would start to behave spontaneously in ways that you couldn't predict from the underlying chemistry and physics. That's the kind of thought.
Yeah, and I do take strong emergence seriously, and connected forms of interactionist dualism, where consciousness plays a causal role. For me, a lot of people say, "Oh, come on, this is totally inconsistent with physics." To me, the most promising place to look in the physics is in quantum mechanics, where there is this, this famous phenomenon of collapse of the wave function, which, at least in traditional quantum mechanics, happens on measurement. And this by no means proves that somehow, oh my God, consciousness is playing a causal role. It's a very controversial idea, but it does, I would say, leave space for exploring that idea. And if you wanted to find a role for consciousness, for an irreducible consciousness in the physical world, I think this is a place to look. So here's where I've actually done some work recently with my co-author, Kelvin McQueen. We've written a couple of papers actually trying to explore this idea, take the old slightly fuzzy idea that, quantum wave function collapse happens on conscious observation, and see if we can actually erect some mathematics around that to make it more detailed. And we used some elements of integrated information theory, a theory of consciousness, as well as elements of spontaneous collapse theories in quantum mechanics to try and build a coherent mathematical version of this idea. And that's a long story. At the end of the day, there are certainly some complications and some costs from pursuing that project, and I'm not sure that we've made it work. But it's an idea that I take seriously. And you're right that if there's the kind of effect of consciousness on the brain, then it means that the argument that this fading qualia argument won't go through quite as straightforwardly. Versions of it could still apply, but they would require further assumptions. And it's an interesting idea to make the argument in reverse from certain intuitive claims to, therefore, strong emergence, or therefore interactionist dualism. I guess I'm skeptical about the initial claim. I don't really see it as plausible, especially antecedently plausible premise that, for example, simulated beings will not be conscious. If you had some antecedent reason to believe that, then something would have to have. I guess I don't find the intuitive force behind that premise.
Just finally on that, and then I'll hand over to Keith to see if he's got a sim blocker. But what about what I said a moment ago? If one is a panpsychist and you think consciousness is the hardware of the world, then it's kind of weird to think that it's going to go along with software stuff like computation. I mean, that's not a contradiction, but it's, it seems.
No, yeah. Because panpsychists are faced with this big problem, the combination problem. I think it was probably solved in one of your books, but I never remember where.
Yeah, you always. That's done. That problem's done, friend.
It's done. Yeah, it was solved in was it chapter 4, chapter 6, chapter 1? I know you have a new solution to the combination problem every year, so I've got to.
That's true. Actually, you got to keep on the toes.
Yeah, but I think So you're right. Panpsychism has one element tied to the hardware, the basic little bits of consciousness, but then there's the way those bits assemble into a consciousness like ours. And for me, this is the part that no one understands, the combination problem. But to me, it's at least some of the more promising approaches here tend to be tied to things like information processing, computational structure. Among those bits, somehow it's got to be the way they're all connected up. And it's at least in that area where they're all connected up, that's a place where I think,
right.
It's natural to look for a connection to computation or information. I mean, somebody might go the other way. They might say, no, it's got to do with some hardware-specific mode of combination. I find that kind of implausible, given that the structure of our consciousness seems to be so deeply connected to the structure of information processing in the brain. So I think any theory of consciousness has to accommodate that somewhere, and then we're going to be at least on the road to finding a connection between computation and consciousness.
Right. Well, I do have another sim blocker I want to raise at some point, but Keith, do you have a sim blocker?
Really, I mean, I think I mean, it's just a very vague point, but it seems I don't see the point of creating simulations, really. I mean, yes, we can use simulations to do scientific research in limited ways, but we're talking about a future society that can create world simulations. Then would they need to do that to is that the only way they'd be able to solve problems they were facing by running simulations? If it was just for the interest of it, the historical interest, well, I don't know. I mean, wouldn't it be more interesting to simulate life on other planets, future scenarios, all kinds of we could explore the universe through simulation rather than sending a spacecraft. We could just simulate other worlds, other beings. So the idea that we are in a simulation created by our ancestors or ancestors of creatures like us seems to me just not very likely, but it's nothing really. I think if we were living much more exciting lives, it might be more plausible. And if we were space explorers exploring new worlds, then I think yes, maybe we've been. This is created to as an alternative to space travel, which is
we are consciousness explorers exploring new worlds. Maybe the three, Keith Frankish and Philip Goff, are going to be prime targets for simulation, so they can get consciousness exploring going.
I think they're wasting their resources. I think that I hope that the funding committees don't look into this, because it might not be the best use of the faculty's computing resources.
Who can come up with the wildest versions of panpsychism and illusionism? Let's put simulation for that. Here we are.
Maybe.
I was wondering if it faces a kind of problem of evil, because the classic problem of evil against God's existence, that it's not plausible that an all-loving, all-powerful being would create a universe with so much suffering in. So you're not going to have as strong an objection as that. But you might think, these technological advanced societies would probably have some basic moral standards, like, you shouldn't torture people. And so they're probably going to set up some, ethics board for the permission to create morally permissible simulations. And, I think if someone wrote into the committee proposing a universe like this, they'd say, no way, what do you mean? There's like tornadoes and hurricanes and cancer and Jesus, what do you, and I was getting carried away. I was thinking they could try and offer some of the theodicies, so Richard Dawkins, I was going to say, Richard Swinburne says, God creates natural disasters because it gives people the chance to show courage and compassion. So that they could try to argue that to the committee, but they'd say that'd be ridiculous. You can't create if people in a simulation are conscious, you can't create such a world with so much suffering. So maybe that gives us a reason actually to think simulations probably won't be so common. Simulations of a universe like this, just because advanced societies with basic moral standards wouldn't allow them.
Yeah, no, this is a serious sim blocker. I mean, this is tied to one of Bostrom's sim blockers. We'll be able to create simulations, but we won't actually create many of them. And yeah, there's various reasons that could happen. Maybe you thought they were dangerous, but ethical. If it turns out that all sufficiently advanced societies with this technology are also morally advanced, then there may well be moral reasons not to create simulations, perhaps of universes like this one. I mean, there are really interesting moral questions here. Is it okay to create simulations where everybody is happy, or is even that like playing God? Is that somehow immoral? Or if it's okay to create simulations where everyone is happy, how about worlds just where there's a net balance of happiness over suffering? I don't know. Maybe creating beings who suffer is sort of morally worse, so you shouldn't do that, even if there's a net balance of happiness. But yeah, but one can certainly imagine that that ethics would be one major reason why people don't create these sim blockers. That said, this does rely on the assumption that these societies are in fact going to be highly moral in their behavior. And I don't know, we've only got one main example right now of an intelligent society, and yeah, I mean, it's intermittently moral, but not actually all that good collectively, even at self-protection, let alone morality. So, I mean, one could be reasonable in assigning a, not finding this sim blocker especially plausible. And all it's going to need is, some rogue, tech companies or experimenters, whatever, who have the technology to use it, or maybe it becomes incredibly useful in some, say, military context or a financial context. You can imagine situations, or scientific context, situations where there are very large incentives to create simulations. I mean, if it's just entertainment, yeah, I don't know. Entertainment is big bucks, but maybe that could be dismissed. But maybe it turns out that the biggest reason people use simulations right now is science. They're huge in all kinds of scientific and engineering contexts. You want to simulate systems to see how they work. And it's very easy to imagine in the future that simulated universes could be useful for the purposes of doing all kinds of science, all the different ways universes could evolve. So yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of incentives for simulations too, and it's an interesting question. Yeah, but in any given society, what's going to win out? The incentives for creating simulations, or the reasons not to? I mean, if you took the view that intelligence and morality were correlated, it's a bit like the Kantian view that if you're super rational, you'll also be super moral. If you took that view, then maybe our super intelligent successors in the future will also be super moral and would create these simulated universes. I guess I'm a little bit skeptical that intelligence and morality correlate like that. So I assign this sim blocker maybe somewhat less probability than you do.
Yeah.
Right, well, so let's turn to. Shall we turn to the other question? So the other aspect of this. So let's suppose we can't rule out the hypothesis that we're in a simulation, or even that it's likely. Does that mean that the universe isn't real, that we're not real, and that the world around us the things around us aren't real? And your answer to this, of course, then carries over to thinking about much more real cases of virtual reality, much more present cases of virtual reality. So if this is a simulation, is it not real?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to an article I wrote called "The Matrix as Metaphysics" back around 2003. That was actually originally intended for the Matrix website, having just seen the Matrix and thinking about it philosophically. Actually, a bunch of philosophers were invited to write articles for the Matrix website to reflect on the movie, and I wrote this article trying to argue that, yeah, we could be in a matrix, but even if we are, the objects around us are real. So, it seems to me now that I'm in a room, in an office filled with books and a computer and some chairs and a desk and a door. And one line would be, if we're in a simulation, all that's an illusion. There is no chair, there is no table, there is no door. Whereas my view is that, even if we're in a simulation, all those things are still out there. They still exist. There's a chair, there's a table, there's a door. It's just that if we're in a simulation, they're ultimately grounded in computation. Or to put it more simply, the chair and the table and so on are made of bits. Standardly, we think they're made of chemical entities, which are made of atoms, quarks, and so on. Well, if we're in a simulation, I say underneath all that is a level of bits, and there's a chair and a table out there, but it's made of bits. And I argue in the book that this is closely related to a hypothesis that some physicists take seriously, at least as a form of speculation, the so-called it from bit hypothesis, that atoms and all the familiar entities of physics are grounded in a layer of digital physics. I saw that somebody in the chat mentioned Stephen Wolfram. He's one of the people that taken the it from bit idea seriously. At least he's explored digital physics, the idea that physics might be grounded in some kind of cellular automaton-like structure, the so-called game of life, where cells can be on or off and they interact according to simple rules. Yes, Stephen Wolfram now has a new, more complex framework, which is a little bit like a somewhat different kind of digital physics with different entities. I haven't explored it in great depth. But you know, it's a super interesting framework, as are some of the other digital physics framework out there. And importantly, people who do digital physics don't think this is a way of saying nothing exists. No, it's just saying this is what the world, this is what things in the world are made of. And in the book, I argue that the simulation hypothesis is basically equivalent to a certain version of this it from bit hypothesis, where objects are made of bits. I mean, it needs a little bit more detail too. For in a simulation, there's a simulator, so there needs to be a creator. This kind of brings in God again. So now we have what I call the it from bit creation hypothesis. God created the world by saying, let there be bits, and arranging the bits, and this created the rest of physical reality. And I say the simulation hypothesis is basically structurally like that. Our simulator, maybe a teenage hacker in the next universe up, arranged all the bits, and that basically had the function of creating this this physical world, and all the objects came along with it. So anyway, if you take that approach seriously, which I try to argue for in the book, then yeah, the simulation hypothesis is no longer quite as depressing. It's not a world where all this is an illusion and a fiction. It's just a world where all this stuff is still perfectly real. It's just that there's more to reality underlying it.
Right. So in that way, thinking about simulated worlds, takes us into thinking about metaphysics generally, and about what's fundamental. And the idea is that bits are as good a candidate to be fundamental as anything else. I think that's. I mean, on any account of what's fundamental, or the accounts that physicists propose, it's kind of weird stuff. It's nothing like the stuff we see around us, and it's rather hard to imagine how this world around us could emerge from it. And so it's not more problematic in thinking of it as being just patterns of ones and zeros. I suppose there is this intuition, though, isn't there? And you discussed this in the book, that there has to be, that it can't just be differences. It has to be differences in something. There has to be some. It can't just be a pattern of relations between things. There need to be things that are related in that way. It can't be a pattern of relations. It has to be relations between things. And I mean, of course, one way to go on that is, I suppose, a panpsychist way in saying what it's a relation, what these are differences between different states of consciousness. Now, I'm really not sure what physicists think about this. I mean, physicists tend to talk about their theories as describing reality. So I think that it's not just the maths on its own. The maths actually is a description of something more than the maths. I mean, do you think this is that this sort of way of thinking is that a good reason for being a panpsychist? Or believing in some unknowable substrate to all this, or are you quite happy with the idea that it is just a pattern of pure differences with no ground?
Yeah, I go back and forth on this. I'm not sure that the simulation idea or the it from bit idea transforms how I think about this, but it certainly provides a very nice illustration of an issue that comes up in general in thinking about the world. Is it all just kind of abstract relational structure, or quasi-mathematical structure, maybe with some causation, or does it have to be actually grounded in something concrete, that puts the fire in the equations, to use Stephen Hawking's phrase? And I go back and forth on this. In the it from bit context, it's at the very least a nice illustration. There's two choices. One is called a pure it from bit hypothesis, where bits are absolutely fundamental in the universe. Maybe the bottom level of the universe is like the game of life. There are just like cells which can be on or off. And it's not like being on or off as like being red and green. No, there's just like two different states, and there's a pure difference between them. I mean, the red versus green idea I can get, or the black and white, or something at the bottom level. But that's not quite pure anymore. That's the bits are grounded in something. The pure version is very abstract. It's not totally clear. Makes sense, but it's not totally clear it doesn't. The impure version is what I call the it from bit from X, or the it from bit from it idea. That there's some level of it that's underneath the bits. I mean, it could be something very directly underneath it, like the red versus green. Actually, if we're a simulation, then probably some version of it from bit from it is true, because we've got all the objects here are made of computer processes that are running on a computer in the next level up, and presumably the computer in the next universe up is not fundamental. It's It's got circuits, it's got voltages inside their analog of transistors or whatever, which is all grounded in something underneath in that world. So that's it from bit from it. Of course, the question might arise about their world. Is that made of bits? That's it from bit from it from bit. and on you go. But at least some of the time I have the situation that the world couldn't be a world of pure structure. That's too abstract. But I also have the intuition, another relevant intuition is we're conscious. And to me, I think consciousness is not something reducible to pure structure for some of the reasons we were talking about earlier. If that's the case, then that's another reason to reject the pure it from bit idea. You might then think of, okay, let's put those two reasons together and let's try and find a ground for the bits and connect it to consciousness. So that's what I call in the book, it from bit from consciousness hypothesis, with the underlying Philip.
That's good to me.
Yeah, the underlying it is in fact consciousness. And I mean, in the game of life case, yeah, maybe the two states or the cells can be conscious or not. Well, they can be conscious of one thing or conscious of another thing. And somehow the interplay of consciousness would be what somehow generates this computational and ultimately natural order. And of course, this is an idea that's quite continuous with the tradition of thinking about panpsychism, some element of consciousness everywhere, and especially what's sometimes called Russellian panpsychism, where the structure of these bits of consciousness somehow mirror the structure of physics, which in this case is digital physics. And I think you could have all these ideas even without digital physics. These ideas could apply directly to continuous physics, but the digital case, I think, is at the very least a vivid illustration. And I do find the it from bit from consciousness idea quite appealing in its own right, for roughly the same reasons I find panpsychism appealing, even though it's also got some big issues to contend with, like how do all those little bits of consciousness combine to yield the kind of consciousness that we have.
So introspection gives us an idea of the sort of thing we need to form this ultimate intrinsic ground of everything. Of course, you could combine that with illusionism. You could say that, well, this intrinsic form of consciousness is an illusion, but that illusion actually gives us a correct view of the fundamental nature of reality. So it could be that our consciousness is an illusion, but the illusory content is actually a correct conception of the ultimate ground of things. I'm not going to defend that, but you could do that. You could
illusionist panpsychism. You heard it first.
It could be an illusionist panpsychism. You've been illusioned by human consciousness.
Well, you know, there's this new paper by Luke Roloff's Denetian panpsychism. So
yeah,
I haven't read that yet. I'm looking forward to reading that. Yes, yes.
We had a meeting of our reading group at NYU on that paper. It was interesting.
Yeah, I'm actually very sympathetic to this idea that a virtual world would be a real physical world, and so even if we're in a simulation, this is just an interesting theory about the fundamental nature of reality, rather than a skeptical scenario where nothing exists. But what I'm maybe more unsure of is whether this helps deal with skepticism. So this is, I guess, a major aim of the book, to undermine these skeptical concerns that we don't really know that the world is real. And one thing I don't remember you talking about, maybe you did, is skepticism about our own memory. So I think, sometimes when people deal with Cartesian skepticism, they're just assuming, our consciousness as it's stretched out over time. And then once you're there, you've maybe got the resources for a sort of inference to the best explanation to an external world. Why do I have this continuous stream of ordered consciousness? There must be something outside of my mind that's impacting on it. But, you might think all I've really got access to is my consciousness right here, right now. And then I have some kind of seeming memories, but, why the hell should I trust them? Why, what reason do I have to think my memory is corresponding to something real? So you might, if you analogy I sometimes give for skepticism, if you just wake up with amnesia down a hole and someone's you just hear a voice explaining to you how you got there, it might be lying, you might be telling the truth. So, and, if we can't even trust our memory, it seems like How can we get it? How can we get anything going? So yeah, I mean, do you think? I mean, what do you think of that kind of radical skepticism? And is there any way this stuff can help address that?
Yeah, I mean, kind of important to say, I don't claim to be refuting skepticism about the external world in this book. I don't have a solution to the skeptical problem. I think this idea that simulations are real and so on, I think it gives us some purchase on the skeptical problem. It gives us, we at least are able to make some headway by showing that some of our Cartesian intuitions, that, you know, various things could be unreal, are actually, you know, not quite right and can be undermined. And this, at least I think, softens up some traditional skeptical arguments will be shown to be unsound. It's certainly not showing that every skeptical argument is unsound. And I'm certainly not saying that every skeptical scenario is a scenario where everything is real. So I'm not refuting the skeptic. One of the major forms of, I've got a whole chapter, the very last chapter of the book goes over a bunch of remaining skeptical possibilities. And it roughly says, well, these ones I'll deal with by this strategy. These ones I'll deal with by this strategy. These ones continue to raise some skeptical problems. In general, for the ones that continue to raise skeptical problems, I try to argue that at least those hypotheses are less simple. So that perhaps maybe abduction, inference to the simplest explanation, might give us a little bit of purchase. But yeah, there's no refutation of the skeptic. But yeah, the case you mentioned about memory is interesting. This comes under a section on temporary simulations in the book. You know, like the could the world have been created 5 minutes ago? Could I just have entered a simulation? One I've got here, in the extreme version of temporary simulation, only the present moment is simulated. Sometimes this will be easy. I'm just waking up from a nap in a dark room. Was that your case? Simulators may need only to simulate a few thoughts of experience within a minimal world model. So in that case, okay, who's going to need a giant universe? I'll just simulate that fuzzy feeling of waking up. When I'm fully awake and attending to the world as I am now, temporary simulations will take more work. The simulators will at least need a model or a basis for everything I'm perceiving and that I'm thinking about. If I might turn my thought and perception to other things, simulators should be ready to simulate those things too. Perhaps the simulation is so brief that this is unnecessary. Could I be in such a momentary simulation right now? I can't rule it out with certainty, but I don't see much reason to think these momentary simulations will be common. In any case, the world model that simulators use for perceiving and thinking about will always serve at least as a local reality, like the local simulations discussed earlier. So the thought is, okay, I'm at least, you know, I'm in a big space, I'm looking around a room, I'm thinking about a whole bunch of stuff. They're at the very least going to need kind of a model to generate those thoughts, those perceptions. That'll at least be kind of like a local simulation. Local simulation is kind of like the Truman Show. You know, you've got some local area being simulated and not beyond that. So that would be the basis for some reality. So I guess that's my best take on the kind of scenarios that you have. Of course, that will give us simulation about things much further away that you're not currently perceiving and thinking about. But here at this point, I'm just trying to refute what I call global skepticism, where nothing outside of me exists.
Yeah,
the simulators have built models outside of me, then global simulationism, skepticism turns out false.
Can I just ask you a little bit of like a meta level question about like what we're trying, what the point of this is? And sorry, that sounds a bit harsh. What is the point of this? But
okay, here's a little secret. The book is presented as refuting, as giving some inroads on the skeptical problem, but that's not ultimately my deep motivation here. I suspect that refuting the skeptic is impossible. So don't really see this book as an attempted refutation of the skeptic. Rather, it's using that skeptical dialectic to have a whole lot of insights into the nature of reality, the nature of the mind, and the connection between them.
But just, I mean, I guess I'm thinking maybe not just about your book, but dealing with skepticism in general. You know, I guess suppose we couldn't refute the skeptical objections. I mean, there's one thing. Does it undermine our certain knowledge, but suppose it even turns out that, you know, we don't even know, maybe we don't even have good reason to believe that there's an external world, you know, we'd still, the old David Hume point, we'd still just carry on. We'd still live the same lives. We'd still, so, you know, what is the value, do you think, of responding to skepticism, or trying to formulate a response to skepticism, given that, you know, we'll just carry on regardless whether we can or not?
You know, I'm not sure that I see the responding to skepticism aspect as being particularly a matter of practical value. As you know, there are people, life goes on whether we're skeptical or not. As you say, even skeptics seem to manage mostly to lead pretty fine lives. So I don't particularly see the responding to skepticism aspect of this, of the book, as being one of the parts that has strong practical value. I think it has philosophical value. It helps us to both get at some grips about reality, get at some grips about, you know, what we can get some grip, what we can know, and what we can't know, which I see as intellectual value, the value of understanding, which is, you know, often the main value I get from philosophy. Now, I do think there is some potential practical value, but that comes in more in thinking about the connection to real virtual reality. I think some of these things we've been saying about simulations being real, some aspect of that also applies much less far out virtual worlds, including the virtual worlds that we'll encounter with real VR technology. And I want to argue that entities in those worlds can be real, and you can actually lead a valuable life there. And these are real practical situations that are going to confront us. And we really do need to think about the technology that's coming, what's its status, what kind of lives can we live. So I think all this reasoning can actually play in to thinking about that technology. But if you want some practical value, I think that's probably going to be the place where it comes in.
Yeah, let's move on to that, perhaps onto onto virtual reality. But perhaps before we do that, can I just raise something that maybe in some people's minds? I mean, suppose this is all ultimately realized in bits in a computer in the next world up, as it were. Then it seems that we're wrong about a lot. We're wrong about the world in many ways. We think of the world as being, you know, spatially extended and you know, physically grounded in physical material, and it, although that's not completely wrong, it is spatial. The simulation is spatially extended. You know, the computer itself is an object in the next world up, occupies space, and it is grounded ultimately in atoms in that world. We're wrong about the nature of this world, it seems. Now, you've got a response to that, and you say that actually we're right about space and matter and so on in this world. Could you articulate that for us?
The question is, if we're in a simulation, are we wrong about there being space and there being time and there being matter out there in the world around us? Yeah, I want to say that I think one of the most powerful intuitions, things that gets kind of Cartesian skepticism going, is the idea that in many of these Cartesian scenarios, things seem to be out there in space around us, but in fact, they're not. It's kind of, for me, it's ultimately a spatial intuition. Maybe time comes in there, but I think space is probably the deepest aspect. I mean, there are some other things too. Maybe things out there seem to be solid, and in fact, they're not. But I think space is where it runs deepest. So if I wanted to hold the line against my view on these things, I'd try and say, okay, yeah, if we're in a simulation, we're ultimately wrong about space. But in the, I guess I'd pick a couple of different points here. I think a version of this actually already applies to. I think this relies on taking certain intuitions about space very seriously, thinking of space as this kind of primitive container in which everything happens, what I call capital S space in the book. And I think we already have reasons grounded in physical science to think space is not like that. I mean, one obvious place to look is relativity theory. It tells us, okay, yeah, intuitively 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, and this is all absolute. In fact, there's 4-dimensional space-time, and no spatial properties are absolute. Once you go to quantum mechanics, and you get this abstract wave function underlying all of this, it looks many of these approaches to quantum mechanics as if space may not even be fundamental. once you get to string theory, that sense is reinforced. Space may just be emergent from this underlying abstract interplay of multidimensional interplay of strings. So this, to me, has kind of had the sense of already deflating some of those strong antecedent intuitions about capital S space. Yeah, maybe things we already have grounds from physics to believe that things aren't out there in capital S space. Rather, there is a much more deflated thing, lowercase s space. And the way I actually understand this in the book is to make a distinction between primitivism about space and functionalism about space. I think that the best way to understand space now is in terms of what plays a certain role in the equations of physics and in the physical world. You know, one slogan here is take the old idea, there's no action at a distance. Instead say distance is what there's less action at. You know, space kind of becomes, at least in part, a metric of causal interaction. And that approach is now actually very popular within among physicists who and philosophers of physics who want to take space as non-fundamental. So once you go there, then suddenly the simulation or the if from bit idea doesn't look much worse. Okay, maybe it's a world where things aren't out there in capital S space, but that's already strongly suggested from physical reality. So one way to put this, you could react to this by going skeptical about ordinary physical reality. Physics has shown that chairs and tables aren't really out there in space. Well, I'd say, well, they're not out there in capital S space, but they're still out there in lowercase s space. So anyway, the strategy of the book is to try to argue that virtual reality is at least on a par with physical reality. I'm going to say physical reality has elements that are somewhat illusory, that there's actually no capital S space and possibly no capital T time, then so be it. But as long as virtual reality is on a par with physical reality, I guess that's good enough for my purposes.
Yes, it's that parity is the important thing. If the things that we would be wrong about in a simulated world, we seem to be wrong about in a non-simulated world anyway, taking these things as primitive, and that's why, of course, the book's reflections on simulated worlds have such relevance, even if we're in a non-simulated one. Okay, so shall we move on?
That's the flip side of virtual reality is genuine reality. It's like genuine reality could be virtual reality. One way that could be true is if we're in a simulation. But yeah, but another thought is even if we're not in a simulation, just look at the kind of physics suggested by current physics, it's kind of got VR-like elements. I found a wonderful quote by Slavoj Žižek.
Oh yeah, I was reading that in your book this morning.
Where he says the ultimate lesson of virtual reality is the virtualization of the true original reality. Yeah, the ultimate lesson of virtual reality is the virtualization of the very true reality. Yes, the ultimate lesson of all this reflection on VR is that physical reality is kind of virtual. Zizek is onto something.
So that's if you like the first half of the book where you're using the simulation hypothesis to address these, some really big metaphysical questions about reality in general. But then the second half, you come onto a much more practical application of these same ideas to situations that we know are actual and that will become increasingly important in our lives. And that's not now simulated reality, but virtual reality. Could you perhaps just begin by distinguishing that from the difference between a simulation and a virtual world, and then talk us through how some of the same issues apply?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the ideas are continuous, simulating a whole full-scale universe from simulating a small universe, but in using digital technology. But I guess there are a few relevant differences. For a start, when we use VR, if I put on a VR headset, here I have my Oculus Quest headset with me.
Oh wow!
If I enter VR, I'm now surrounded by a virtual world, which I kind of experience from the inside in this three-dimensional way. But okay, for a start, I know I'm in VR. The epistemological issue of am I in VR, and it doesn't really arise. I put on the headset. I know I'm using the headset. The worlds are much simpler than full-scale physical universes. And here we're not so much thinking about this as a simulation hypothesis. I'm thinking about it as a hypothesis about all of our reality. This is all a simulation. this is a situation I enter locally, temporarily, and some portion of my life. So in the book, I tend to reserve the word simulation for the full-scale whole universe simulation hypothesis idea, and reserve the word virtual world for these worlds that we enter knowingly, voluntarily, using the technology of the day. Even though I think there's some sense in which they're both simulations and they're both virtual worlds. But then, yeah, many of the same questions arise. The question, do we know we're in VR, is not so relevant, but are the entities we're interacting with real, and can we lead a meaningful life in the environments? And I want to say yes to both of those questions.
Right, that's something leading a meaningful life. That's a very important aspect of this, isn't it? Both in for the simulation hypothesis itself, and also as we spend increasing amount of our time in virtual worlds. So, and of course, we think of Nozick's famous experience machine, the machine that will create all kinds of wonderful experiences for you, but which I think many people feel is a kind of fake. It's not a good way to spend your life, to be having simulated experiences. So how can this kind of simulated experience still be meaningful for us?
Yeah, I mean, the experience machine is interesting. I want to argue that virtual reality is actually somewhat different from Nozick's experience machine. Nozick said, just say this experience machine gave me this wonderful experiences, all pre-programmed for life, and said we wouldn't enter that. And he had three reasons. I think, at least as I understand it, there are three main reasons. One is that all this is pre-programmed. It's scripted. None of this, you don't really have any autonomy. You just kind of lay out your life according to the script. He thinks that's not valuable. Well, I think VR is not like that. I mean, maybe some video games, there's some elements of a script. But you enter a virtual world, like say Second Life, you get to make your own decisions. You can create relationships, enter relationships, create community, have projects, achieve them. I think in a genuine full-scale virtual world, they'll certainly not pre-programmed. You'll certainly have autonomy and free choice to the extent that we have them in the physical world. Nozick also said all this is an illusion. None of it ever really happens. You have the sense of doing things, but you don't do those things. Well, obviously I'm going to reject that. A very important part of this book is arguing that life in a virtual world needn't be illusory. His third reason is that the experience machine is artificial. It's human-made, and we value contact with natural reality. And I don't know. I guess that is a potential downside of VR. It is by nature artificial, human-made. In VR, not so much in contact with nature. On the other hand, I already spend most of my life indoors. I live in a city, New York City, and most of us are indoors most of the time. I can't say I'm actually, in full-scale contact with nature most of the time. But life is still pretty good. It's pretty meaningful. It's still pretty meaningful. Contact with nature, I don't see as one of the essential elements for a meaningful life. Some people really value it. I respect that. And maybe those people, for them, VR is not so much for them. But that seems very much an optional value and not something that makes life meaningful versus meaningless. So I think at the very least, Nozick's reasons for rejecting the experience machine are not good reasons to reject VR. And more generally, I'd argue, take the sources of value, what makes for a good life or a meaningful life. What are they? I mean, relationships with other people, projects and goals that we achieve. I don't know, helping others, building communities, maybe knowledge and understanding, maybe certain kinds of just straight experiences or value conferring. I think all of those, as far as I can tell, can be had in virtual reality. And of course, it's especially important that we are conscious beings. I think consciousness is in some sense very deeply connected to the ground of all value. We bring our consciousness to VR. I think, we're conscious beings who value things. Even in the physical world, we invest many things with value. It's because we value them, they have value for us. And just as we can invest a physical world with value, I think we can invest a virtual world with value too. So far, we may not have invested it with as much value. So I'm not going to say right now they have the same kind of value, but ultimately, I don't see why a virtual world couldn't be invested with much of the value of a physical world.
I guess it's
thinking about. Oh, sorry. No, just think about nature. There, it's just a frivolous comment, but the pandemic has really set the scene for this book very well. If there are sim operators watching this, maybe it's been a bit of advanced publicity for a book about living in a enclosed in a private environment away from nature and so on.
Yeah, although Philip, may also have prepared us for anti-simulation, anti-virtual backlash, because everyone's living life on Zoom hasn't been all that satisfying. Actually, it's not bad. I talk to my parents every week over Zoom, and this is actually, it's totally meaningless by any means, but I do think the virtual reality goes far beyond the kind of virtual communication we have via Zoom.
Right. I think it's probably hastened the adoption of some of these kinds of communication.
The Oculus Quest headset, Quest 2, sold like hotcakes as soon as it was released in the middle of the pandemic. And of course, now we've had Facebook rebranding itself as Meta for the coming metaverse. And if you're speaking of simulators trying to help sales of my book, well, maybe the simulators had a direct line to Mark Zuckerberg. That's certainly
presumably the metaverse does contrast with the.
What's up?
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say presumably the metaverse does contrast with the meatverse. Presumably, I'd see.
That's one way to think about it. Yeah, I also think about the metaverse versus the multiverse. The multiverse of physical worlds and the metaverse of virtual worlds.
Philip, you were going to say something. Sorry.
Well, I will. But I guess if people want to start raising questions in the chat, we could have some audience questions. If you want to put a Q or a question to distinguish it from what's gone before. My wife during COVID isolation has been going on long virtual walks. You can go on YouTube, on the treadmill, and it's beautiful walks around Britain and staying sane that way. But I guess
is that scripted, or can she choose where to walk?
Can she choose? No.
It's a bit more like the experience machine. She's got to live. She's kind of going down a script, but can't make choices that deviate from the script.
Yeah, it's a bit limited in that respect.
A bit like watching a 3D movie or something.
Right. Yeah. I guess. I mean, I was going to say one crucial part of there being value in the simulation is that other simulated people are also conscious as well as ourselves, right? I mean, I guess that's one major dystopian simulation scenario, that I'm the only conscious person or whatever. And I guess so that's not a form of skepticism that the simulation approach helps with, the virtual reality approach helps with, I guess. Skepticism about minds.
The philosopher Grace Helton at Princeton University has been writing articles on skepticism about other minds and connecting that to the simulation idea. And she thinks we actually ought to take very seriously the idea that there will be simulations with just one conscious being, maybe partly for the ethical reasons that you raised before. Maybe creating consciousness in a simulation will be very much disfavored, and you certainly don't want to create whole worlds of trillions of conscious beings. Maybe some of the simulation, many of them will be zombie simulations where no one is conscious, if that's possible. Or maybe if we're, say, studying consciousness itself, you'll get permission to sometimes create simulations where one person is conscious. But at least under certain assumptions, it could turn out that most of the conscious beings are in one conscious person simulations, which then give you some kind of Boston-like statistical reasons to believe that you're the only conscious being in the universe. I'm not sure if I buy that line of reasoning, but it's super interesting. And there is a philosophical problem of other minds, and I'm certainly not trying to refute it using the simulation idea here. And yet you might use something like Grace Helton's argument to say the simulation hypothesis makes it even more of a serious worry.
Yeah, I think I cut off for a minute there. Yeah, so this is I just can't help coming back to worries about the still deep skepticism with memories and other minds that we're still mired in, and yeah, it seems like not much consolation to think. I guess tables and chairs are not the most worrying kind of skepticism, but
actually, Grace Halton also takes a line like this. She says, once we have skepticism about other minds, it'll give us skepticism about the social in general, and so much of the external world that we care about is social. That so what if we've, maybe even many of our concepts of ordinary chairs and tables even are at some level social concepts. So maybe we've made less inroads into skepticism if we haven't, if we've only done a trivial recovery of, say, physics and haven't brought back the mental and the social.
Well, there's always an option.
I don't think the main motivation behind this book should be understood as undermining skepticism.
Right. Yeah. There are lots of applications. Keith?
There's always the option of going structural realist about consciousness, of course.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, structuralism about someone could write a book parallel to this one where you say, okay, yes, the simulation hypothesis makes the problem of other minds all the more serious because we could be in simulations. However, I'm going to answer this by showing that in all simulations people are conscious, because of, say, for structuralist reasons. I actually do believe that in many simulations people are conscious, but not quite I'm not quite a structuralist about I'm a nomological structuralist about consciousness. Maybe I think as a matter of nomological fact, replicating the structure of a brain will replicate the consciousness. There's certainly room for someone to take a parallel strategy for consciousness. And when I was writing the book, I was totally imagining Keith going, okay, great. Eden, now for consciousness. Capital C, consciousness, get rid of it.
Absolutely. It's so much of this is it's like my I don't mean this in an arrogant way. It's like my own thought process. I'm just I agree. That's absolutely. And then just take that. They've still just got one foot in conscious in Eden, and you just need to just finally just take that last step out of Eden, and it will all be fine.
Be cast out of Eden into the cold world.
Yeah, you've done this same trick with me, Keith, saying, Galileo's real error is to think there's any qualities at all. You're always trying to say, basically, you're one step off my position. Just go that little bit further.
Obviously, yes. But this is the thing. I try to, to see what I can agree with in people who in people who take different views. I try to find what's right, and then I try to think, if they just made that little.
We definitely have to come to audience questions, but something you said there, Dave, I thought people might be interested to know that you kind of said it there. I mean, how you can be a dualist on the one hand and yet think computational simulation gives you consciousness. I mean, I think people might be interested to see how you square that circle of bringing those two things together. And then we'll definitely come to audience questions.
Well, I mean, dualism versus materialism is all about, is consciousness reducible to a physical process, or maybe does it merely correlate with a physical process? But then they take the view of like functionalism versus biologicalism, you might call it, or computationalism versus biologicalism. There, the issue is, does consciousness go along with certainly specific biological processes, or maybe with certain kinds of computational processes? And as far as I can tell, those two things are just orthogonal to each other. 2x2 matrix, reduction versus correlation, and then biology or computation. You can say it reduces to the biology, as some identity theorists do. You can say it correlates with the biology. You could say it reduces to computation or correlates with computation. And I just embrace the cell in that matrix that says it correlates with computation. I've got prior arguments for dualism. Consciousness is not reducible to a physical process, but I still think it obviously co-varies in a very deep way with physical processes. And for me, by far the most plausible hypothesis, given what we know about consciousness, is that it co-varies with information processing or computational processes in the brain. So that's a step downstream from the dualism, if you like. But that tends to me to at least strongly suggest that the basic laws of consciousness connect it to something that's potentially structural, computational, and at least it makes me very open to the idea that simulations will be conscious.
Right.
I know
so
usually it goes there, but yeah.
Yeah, the laws of the psychophysical laws connect consciousness to computational properties. And
exactly.
Okay, let's get some questions. Andrew Earth, does the possibility of countless independent, disconnected, separate, rebootable virtual realities make what happens in any one virtual world less meaningful?
Yeah, I don't know. To me, this looks a little bit like, does the fact that we exist in one little corner of the universe and this planet out on the edge of one spiral arm of this galaxy and this huge cosmos, where maybe there are all these other planets and maybe even all these other civilizations and so on, does that make this one less meaningful? I'm inclined to think not. I think our life is still meaningful, even in that context of being in a giant universe where we're a tiny, tiny fraction. And I think I'd say that, yeah, the same is true for virtual worlds. The fact that there are countless independent, separate virtual worlds, it could be, especially if the simulation hypothesis is true, or even the ones we create. But I don't see why it makes one less meaningful. I guess if it turned out that there was only one world and one civilization in the entire universe, then that would be maybe have a special kind of meaning. But I don't think the fact that zillions of environments exist make them less meaningful.
What if
is interesting.
What if a lot of
go on?
What if a lot of those simulations are very similar? If there are lots and lots of versions of our current environment being run with us in it, and each taking different paths, as in a sort of multiverse view, wouldn't that make the significance of the choices we make knowing that in another world another version of me will make the other choice?
That's interesting, and it's kind of reminiscent of David Lewis's modal realism, where every possible world exists. And people say that make kind of morality kind of irrelevant. Okay, I'll do something good here, but there's a counterpart of me that's doing something bad there. So I can't really make a difference to the whole of reality. And that, I think, would be a genuine worry. I'd be surprised if VR takes exactly that form. And I suppose I'd still like to think yeah, we can make a difference to our reality, and that hopefully making a difference to our reality will make a difference to reality as a whole, unless reality as a whole has been set up in some super perverse way. So I guess I better hope that reality has not been set up in that super perverse way.
I suppose the rebootable part of it, particularly thinking about VR, that if you're having an adventure in VR, you can keep saving and dying and going back to the save point and so on. And worlds in which that is true, it seems that things like risk and the meaningfulness of one's choices are reduced a little bit, maybe.
So it was the rebootable aspect.
Well, yeah, that was what made me think about it. But if you spend a lot of time in a virtual world where if you make a bad choice, you can simply go back to the last save point and carry on again.
That's it.
There's a sort of sense in which that life would seem less significant than ours.
I agree. That would seem like a world that we were kind of gaming or manipulating and so on. And to me, that would have less significance. I don't know. Maybe having backup clones where if you die, you can reinstate yourself from an upload copy. Maybe that would be okay. But being able to have a do-over for everything. Yeah, and I could automatically become the world champion of everything by just doing over the last point or the last chess move and so on. Yeah, that would seem less meaningful to me because your challenges would be much less, your achievements would be much less, and that would suddenly seem to scale back the heavyweight meaning of your life.
Question: are psychedelic trips virtual realities or a virtual world?
I mean, it's interesting. There are so many cases here. Like dreams are another relevant case. Basically hallucinated worlds that are partly created within your brain. I mean, in some ways, they're dreams, and psychedelic worlds are somewhat analogous to virtual worlds, but there are a couple of differences. One big difference, of course, is they're created by your own minds, typically. I mean, maybe psychedelic trips that interact, you perceive the physical world, and it's augmented in various ways. But let's go for the case of a internally generated one. Dreams, I think, are mostly internally generated with some connections to the outside world. So they're mind dependent in a way that virtual worlds are not. And that's so one of the key notions of reality was mind independent. So they're less real in that sense. I guess the other question is whether they have all the causal powers of a virtual world. I think it's very important, objects, and we were talking about being able to take many different paths, and objects in these virtual worlds can do many different things. I think some dreams, at least, are more like kind of like playing out of a script or something, that Nozikian thing, rather than these entities that genuinely have a lot of different causal potentialities interacting with each other. I don't know. Maybe not dreams are like that. Maybe not all psychedelic trips are like that. But I guess partly for those reasons, I'm inclined to think they're less dreams, schizophrenic hallucination, psychedelic trips are less full-scale autonomous realities than, say, a virtual reality is. But maybe some cases where they unfold in a somewhat more autonomous way that at least gets them closer.
And of course, that's something you say a lot about in the book, about the case for thinking of virtual objects as simulate objects as being real is that we can interact with them in the same way that we can interact with physical ones, even if they're just ultimately patterns of ones and zeros. They amount to things that have a causal effect on us, and which we can affect in turn. And it's in that interaction that their reality really lies.
And I think part of the interaction is there's many possibilities for interaction. It's not just living out a script where we seem to be interacting, but if I did this, they do that. If I did this, they do that. And I think I don't know whether dreams maybe have some elements of that, but I don't think they have it in a full-scale way.
And you have some very interesting discussion about well, you talk about Boltzmann brains, but also about just coincidental collections of particles that assume a certain form and unfold in a certain way. But unless, as you say, the appropriate counterfactuals are true of them, that they would unfold in this way if this thing happens, so on, they don't really count as instantiating real minds and brains and interactions and so on.
Question from Unknown Knowns Philosophy. What credence does Chalmers put in full-blown idealism? Does he see it as more plausible than physicalism?
I think idealism is somewhere in the mix. It also depends a lot what you'd count as idealism. I understand idealism as everything is grounded in the mental. That's consistent with single mind idealism, where everything's grounded in a single mind, like the mind of God, form of cosmopsychism. But it's also consistent with a version of panpsychism, where there are mental properties everywhere. There are many different minds, and the whole world is grounded in the interaction of those minds. I guess, I think I'm sympathetic with panpsychism and cosmopsychism as possibilities. I think they're both faced by a massive combination problem or decombination problem. I do think there are idealists, but neither of those views are committed to idealism. Panpsychism and cosmopsychism are committed with the idea that some of the properties here are mental, but there are non-mental properties. I mean, you might treat, say, space and time as non-mental properties. You could go idealist about those two, and that's an open possibility. I guess in the part of my credence space that goes for, let's say I have 30% of my credence space for versions of panpsychism. Maybe about half of that goes to versions of idealism. So 15% for idealism. Physicalism, I don't know. If you count certain kinds of Russellian panpsychism as physicalism, then that goes up. But let's say we don't. Then I guess the form of physicalism I like best is the illusionism. And I've sometimes said I've got 3% credence for illusionism. I do find it's hugely implausible and unbelievable, but hey, I'm a philosopher. I could be wrong. Maybe we all need to have a bit of humility. I could be wrong. So 3% for illusionism, maybe another 2% for other forms of physicalism, because I could be wrong there too. So 5%. So yeah, idealism 15%, physicalism 5%. Oh, idealism wins. How about
that? Unknown Knowns has another interesting question. Doesn't the reason we are simulated affect our meaning of life quite a bit? What if pains and hardships are simulated for the purpose of alien entertainment? I mean, this brings to mind again the interesting connections you make to theism. You know, the ways in which we can think of the simulation hypothesis as a kind of theism, like there's a thinking of the simulator as a creator in some case, in some sense. And I suppose, again, that the issue of the creator's intentions, people like the theistic hypothesis, I guess, because they think it's a good creator that's wants to have a relationship with us and endow our lives with meaning and so on. But there could be some nasty simulators as well, or I guess this.
Yeah, no, if we're constantly being manipulated, then that certainly becomes more of a dystopian possibility. Maybe, yeah, if the simulators are frustrating us around every corner, or if we're constantly being helped, it's like, oh man, my book on simulation is doing well. I got to be in Mind Chat with Phil Goff and Keith Frankish, and wow, this is exciting. Maybe it's just like, oh, the simulators put him in the successful author simulation just to make me feel good. Yeah, no, that would definitely, if I discovered this was true, that would definitely remove some of the value from whatever, say, sense of achievement I might have had. So yeah, there are definitely these ways in which what's going on with simulators could affect the value of our lives. I guess I'm taking my default here to be the simulators kind of set up the world and let it go and don't interfere too much. And if that's what's going on, I want to say that meaning is on a par with setting up physics and letting it go. But yeah, there are these more pathological possibilities that would definitely have some impact on questions of value and meaning.
Maybe you plan this for yourself. Maybe you design this simulation for yourself. As maybe you're in some future world where, you know, there's no challenges, everything's fine, and you thought, I want to live a life of a rock star philosopher, techno philosopher, and
yeah, maybe I just chose that. Maybe I just chose that program in Nozick's experience machine. Put me in the blah 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 author experience machine. Actually, as Jennifer Nagel pointed out to me, Nozick himself should have taken very seriously the possibility that he was in the experience machine. He was a very handsome philosopher working at Harvard University with won the American Book Award. His work was so acclaimed. Of course, he's in the experience machine. You have an illustration of that in the book.
Here's a less philosophical question connected to what we've just been talking about. What VR stuff does David do with his Oculus headset?
Let's see. Last night, I actually, for the first time, went into VR and gave a full-scale talk there to a bunch of people in a space called Alt Space VR. So occasionally use it for yeah, that was fun. Still a few glitches, but occasionally use social VR. I've got a bunch of philosophers who I hang out with regularly in VR, a group of 7 or 8, although sometimes it's just 3 or 4 people at a given time. And yeah, sometimes we play games. Beat Saber is a very, very popular one. We kind of get a bit of a workout and dance and slice the cubes, but also a social platform for just hanging out and talking. I actually use the headset less than you might think. I mean, I spend, who knows, a huge amount of my life in front of a computer screen, and I'm addicted to the internet and so on. I don't find VR addictive in quite the same way. I'll go in for 30 minutes at a time or something, but then I don't know if it's exactly the nausea or the motion sickness, or just there's something about it which, at least right now, is slightly aversive. You don't want to spend 6 hours inside VR. So, you know, so I use it here and there. Once there's a really great social platform, or once people start organizing conferences in VR, that'll be interesting. I'm part of an augmented reality project at Glasgow that's just getting off the ground. And there's been some talk of having some workshops actually in VR. And I'd like to see that start to happen. That could be interesting.
Yeah, because what I miss about Zoom conferences is, you know, chatting in the coffee break and so on. If you could,
yeah, it's totally gone. But in VR, you can do that. You can just wander. Our avatars can wander over into a corner and talk to each other.
Maybe just do 1 or 2 more. Here's an interesting one, actually. Peter Roberg asks, if small c space is real in simulations, is the same true for small t time? Does this have connections to the issue of consciousness? So how do we think about time in a simulation? Or
yeah, I mean, I do think that the capital T versus small t distinction is fairly plausible for time, in that, you know, we have this sense of time flowing and passing as on so-called A theories of time. But physics seems to strongly suggest in various ways that maybe that nothing like that is real. There's just these structural relations between evolution of certain processes in a block universe. So I do think some such distinction is plausible. I guess I don't think it's forced on you by the simulation idea to quite the same extent, because simulations, life seems to unfold in time, simulations unfold in time in a similar way. And at least for ordinary experiences, say a VR of a simulation, you can just hold on to the idea that these are still unfolding even in capital T time. Now, maybe there are things that can happen that would destabilize that. Maybe we'll build universe simulations where 1 second passes in the simulated time and a century passes inside the simulation, and we'd speed it up and slow it down. And maybe that might somehow destabilize our notion of capital T time.
Yeah, Yanis Varoufakis, I just finished his new book, Another Now, and it's created in that a machine that you just go in it for a split second, but it's a sort of eternity of time, and so you can kind of live forever. But he has to destroy it because big tech tries to steal it and manipulate it, so it ends up getting destroyed. But yeah,
who wrote that book?
You know Yanis Varoufakis, who was the Greek finance minister in the Syrian government, and it's about they create a wormhole to an alternative universe which split in 2008, and after the crisis they rebuilt society in a kind of post-capitalist way, and it's an excuse for him to lay out his
like an allegory.
Yeah, it's an excuse for him to lay out in great detail his post-capitalist ideal society, and great. It's great. Cool. Okay, we got one more question here, going back to classic Chalmers. I guess just during a conversation with Richard Brown, you referred to type B physicalism as incoherent. Could you expand more on this and why you included it as a response to the zombie argument? So we're going very much back to the hard problem here. I guess you said you're attracted to illusionism as the if you're going to go for materialism. What is wrong with the more conventional materialist view that consciousness is perfectly real? It's just identical with certain patterns of neural firings or something. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, so there's a reference here to type B physicalism. So I guess I make the distinction between type A physical. I mean, there's all these big apparent epistemic gaps for consciousness. It's like from the physical facts, you couldn't know the phenomenal facts. You can conceive of physical facts without the facts about consciousness. Type A physicalism denies the epistemological gap. It says, there isn't one. Really, those zombies are inconceivable, and in principle, you could figure out all the facts from the physical facts. Maybe Keith's illusionism is one kind of type A physicalism. But the type B physicalist says, there's an epistemological gap, but it's just epistemological. It's not a gap in nature. Consciousness is identical to a physical process. Maybe we've just got two different ways of thinking about the same thing. And this is often spelled out with an appeal to phenomenal concepts. You've got special concepts of consciousness that are different from our concepts of the physical world. Why do I reject that? Oh boy, so complicated. Many different reasons.
This is where we start to disagree, actually, isn't it? You're saying when we first met, I was saying, you're wrong. You're wrong.
Yeah,
and
that was it.
How exactly to disagree with this type B physicalist position that much of my PhD was on, actually.
You thought my arguments against type B physicalism were not very good, and that you had better arguments against type B physicalism. The type B physicalism says, there are these two concepts that could pick out the same thing. One of my arguments against that view used this framework of two-dimensional semantics to try and argue that where you had these different concepts, there would always be different properties too. Another argument I've given is it doesn't really help with what I call the explanatory gap, because you need to assume special features of phenomenal concepts that are just as hard to explain as those features of as the special features of consciousness that one might have been trying to explain. So it's complicated. It's a very popular view. It's still a popular view out there. Maybe not quite as popular as it once was, but it's a popular and important view. It's got a lot going for it because seems like you might be able to have your cake and eat it too. Yeah, consciousness, intuitions about consciousness, but still physicalism. But yeah, ultimately, I think it does require some very strong underlying philosophical commitments that I'm not comfortable making.
I guess this is something we can all agree on, actually, on this. This is we're absolutely all on the same page.
David Papineau is coming next week, right? He'll be
Yeah, I mean, I guess if people are interested in the techie details a tiny bit, I guess the difference between me and Dave is, as I understand it, Dave might disagree on even how we disagree, but the two-dimensional semantic framework, I mean, my issue was that it sort of has the assumption that all concepts have a kind of a priori bit, and I actually agree with David Papineau, our next guest, that maybe that isn't true. Maybe there could be some concepts that are just sort of point at things and have no kind of a priori bit. So I kind of agree with David Papineau against Dave Chalmers' general semantic assumption there. And then my approach is rather to focus on specifically experiential concepts, what Dave called and people generally call now phenomenal concepts, and say they're not like that. Maybe there could be concepts that just kind of point, but experiential concepts aren't like that. When I think about my pain introspectively, I'm not just sort of blindly pointing at something. I don't know what the hell it is. But anyway, yeah, it's
well, that's it. I mean, you've got to point at the phenomenal bit. I mean, whatever, I can point quite happily to whatever's happening right now, and without any commitment to there being a distinctively phenomenal bit to it. So it's got to be pointing to this phenomenal thing that's present to me.
Yeah, that's interesting, Keith. I mean, the way you characterized your view before, you said, I'm happy to say I can recognize certain things inside myself. I guess that's kind of how David Papineau thinks about experiential concepts, but he doesn't want to say he's an illusionist. He wants to say that's just our ordinary kind of concept. Whereas I think Keith and I both agree that's not the normal kind of philosopher's kind of idea of consciousness, at least. Yeah, getting a bit techie now, aren't we? But,
yeah, I think Philip, your and my just differences here. It's a bit like the Marxist, the Leninist, the Trotskyite, and so on. It's like, yeah, ultimately, I think the arguments we want to make against the type B materialist is somewhat similar. Maybe it's true that your version of it requires somewhat fewer assumptions than mine. But yeah,
I think you're going to kill me with an ice pick.
I think there's another point that David has himself mentioned, that once you accept type B physicalism, you don't feel sort of any, you still feel completely puzzled by how it can be true, even if you've accepted on abductive grounds that it is true. You still feel it doesn't it just doesn't seem right. Whereas once you've inferred that Clark Kent is really Superman, you're okay with that. But in this case, there's some sort of resistance, and
the gap doesn't go away.
This is why I think we do need to talk about illusion, because it's either there's something there that's either real and problematic or illusory, and I think this is where we're all on the same page. The idea that you can sort of conceptualize it away, just no, not with that.
Does this mean you're going to kill me with an ice pick if this is sort of?
Oh yeah, who's Trotsky?
Oh no, it was Stalin who killed. It wasn't Lenin, but Stalin killed Trotsky with an ice pick. But
I didn't quite get which of us was which, but
I think Philip and I were some versions of this, and Keith is a different thing.
Oh right, okay. Well, that's good.
An evil capitalist in this analogy.
Oh God, I am now. No, I'm an anarchist. I'm an anarchist.
Type B physicalism is the czar, right?
I'm Kropotkin. I'm an anarchist.
I'm sure there's a paper in this somewhere. Yeah,
paper in everything somewhere.
Well, Dave, thank you for coming on. It's been a fascinating discussion, and everyone should definitely buy this book, which is how's it going, by the way? How is the book going? Is it
good? Here's the American version, by the way. You had the American version has a butterfly on the cover, and the British version has clouds on the cover. But yeah, it just came out on Tuesday and seems to be doing well. People seem to be talking about it, which is great. And I walked to my local bookstore; they didn't have it yet. I hope that means they sold all their copies, but who knows? But yeah, so far so good.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for coming along, and I hope you continue your simulated existence.
By the way, if I want to read the chat afterwards, do you guys save the chat, or how does it work?
I think it goes up on YouTube, doesn't it? I think it appears on YouTube. There's a bit of processing happens, but it does seem to appear there eventually. Yes.
Okay, very good. Looks like there's lots of great stuff here in the chat. So I'll go back and study that later.
Sean Carroll is the ultimate Jeff Bezos style capitalist in this book.
I thought Dan Dennett was going to be the
yeah.
No.
Bezos figure, but no. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dave. Wonderful book, wonderful chat.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks you very much.
Thanks. Real pleasure talking to you both.
Absolutely. We enjoyed it very well. I enjoyed it. Yeah. Absolutely. Nope.
Oh, okay. Wow. We've done another 3-hour one. We're gonna have to make these things short, won't we? I don't know, but
yeah. I hope people enjoyed it, and perhaps we are a little indulgent sometimes, but I know Dave, I could talk to him all day. So it's always fascinating to talk to him. He's one of the most. He's someone once asked me who was the. Well, I can't remember which famous sportsman. I can't remember which sportsman it was. Some Olympic athlete. The pinnacle of the profession and philosophy. And I said, well, I think it's got to be Dave Chalmers, because whether you agree with him or not, he's one of the sharpest, deepest, most accessible thinkers. And it's always a pleasure to engage with him and his work.
Absolutely. I like how much variety there is in the book as well. Different. I think I got hooked up on the skepticism issue, but there's such a. I guess that's exploring so many different of the big questions. I suppose my only regret is we didn't bully you more. I think that was my. I need to think about.
What is it with this antagonism with you? You need some sort of anger management or something. It's chill. It's all good. It's all.
You've got more followers than me on Twitter. That's the problem. Only bitter.
I've promised to explain the hard problem of consciousness in the style of Stanley Unwin. I don't know if you know who Stanley Unwin is. When I reach,
I don't. It rings a bell.
We'll go and have a look. He's a wonderful. He was a wonderful entertainer who talked in this unique kind of gobbledygook.
I look forward to that. So yeah, unknown philosophy. I need to keep sorting out my light. I kind of like this lighting. I think it looks, but I guess most people think it doesn't. And you need your camera above you, don't you? I need to arrange this next time. I will look. This is why I'm losing the arguments. You see the lighting. But well, I guess we're kind of running out of time. I was thinking next time you should plug your podcast, Keith. Your new.
Maybe yes. I'm moonlighting, doing a little. I actually it's a rather different thing. It's an audio podcast. It was an interview that I did before we started Mind Chat with Nicholas Humphrey. We did a long talk. And eventually, after a couple of hard disk crashes, I managed to get it edited and get it out. And so, I've branded it as the first in a new series. And so, hopefully, I'll be doing some more of those. But those are more. Well, I was going to say less combative than Mind Chats. More reflective, perhaps a little more in the way of just asking questions and letting the interviewee respond. But I might just want this.
I'm looking forward to listening to it. Maybe next time in our after chat we could discuss your whole interview. I haven't
good idea. Oh, and our next one. It's not next week, is it? Is it? Or is it?
We haven't got a date booked in yet. But
right, because I think you said next week, and I got.
Did I? Maybe I did say next week, but next month.
Next month we'll look. That should be a good one with David. We should be able to get down really into the fine details of the metaphysics of consciousness. I think.
Absolutely, sort it all out. And at the end of the day, like as we found with Dave, there are many things we agree on, and I think at the end of the day, we can both agree that consciousness is wherever it is,
and nowhere else.
This is the worst one yet.